Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome to this new episode in our close reading series on Leo Tolstoy's What is Art? Today we are reading the 8th up to the 11th chapter, and these chapters cover the characteristics of the definition of art as manifestation of beauty. So far in the two preceding episodes, we covered in the first episode, chapter 1 to 4, which are about identifying what art is for the aestheticians, the critics, the lovers of art, etc. We said that they defined art as a manifestation of beauty without being able to provide a clear definition of what beauty is. But we settled for beauty as an aesthetic pleasure. So art is a means to provide pleasure, and for it, millions of lives and resources are sacrificed to produce it, which kind of begs the question, is it worth it? And Tolstoy argues, no, it's not worth it at all, and this particular kind of art is incredibly harmful to people and society at large. But we still didn't dive into that. Last week's episode, which covered chapter 5 to 7, was about giving a historical account of how we got to develop and accept the account of art as manifestation of beauty, which is an exclusive theory of art to the European upper classes of the 18th century onward. We've seen that against this definition, Tolstoy defines art as an activity that infects others with feelings, like the artist has a feeling and he or she uses it to, uses art to convey that feeling to an audience, and each member of that audience, infect those around them with the same feeling. So Tolstoy maintains that this is how art was made throughout all of human history, and the 8th chapter picks up on that idea. We explained how the theory of art as manifestation of beauty came about, in what circumstances, and why it is wrong to even contemplate the possibility that this theory already pre-existed the 18th century, like for example in ancient Greece. Nowhere else in the world besides 18th century Europe, after the upper middle classes of the late Middle Ages grew disenchanted with church Christianity and looked for a way to fill the religious void, like nowhere else besides there did this theory emerge. Never before art was viewed as the manifestation of beauty, or its point was to convey beauty, meaning to please an audience. Instead, Tolstoy argues that art had another function until then, which is to convey to others the loftiest and best feelings people have attained to in life. So in other words, art had the function of infecting others with feelings, and more precisely with the feelings judged good by a given society. So we defined good feelings in this narrow and relative sense, what helps people get closer to whatever ideal set by such society, the good for societies. And therefore, good art is the art that infects people with good feelings, and bad art is the one that infects people with bad feelings, meaning feelings opposed or contrary to that ideal. But I insist, both good and bad art are still genuine art. As long as art is infecting you with a certain feeling, it is genuine art. So to determine if it is good or bad art, that depends on whether the feeling is good or bad. Like, does it get you closer to the ideal set by society or get you further away from it? And of course, this implies that a good feeling for one society can be considered bad for another. If feeling A gets you closer to ideal X, while feeling B gets you away from it, but the same feeling A gets you away from ideal Y, but B gets you closer to Y, then a society that has ideal X will consider A to be a good feeling, while B a bad feeling. But a society that values Y as its ideal will consider feeling A bad and feeling B good. So anyways, the point is, this is how things were done for all of human history as far as art is concerned. And we also stress that art is an essential human activity, since besides the communication of ideas, we also need the communication of feelings in order to make societies. So if it is indeed such an important activity and has been around forever, if that activity is halted, then the question becomes, how could it happen that mankind should live a certain rather long period of its life, from the time when people cease to believe in the church teaching down to the present day, without this important activity, and be satisfied instead with the worthless activity of art that merely affords pleasure? So if we replace the activity that infects with feelings with the one that merely affords pleasure, indeed we need to ask, how are we going to deal with life now? The first thing to do here, before answering the question, which obviously is rhetorical, but still can be answered. It is the correct. It is to correct a common mistake, which is ascribing to our art the significance of true universally human art. So this means that people tend to see the art of their society as true universal human art, like their art is the best art there is for everybody. Basically, it's like when someone hates your art or argues that your art or the art that you enjoy is not real art or is just basic. Whereas their art, their preferred type of art, is the pinnacle expression of genius. Classical music, real art. Rock and roll, not art. Only idiots would listen to rock. Fine men, however, listen to Beethoven or watch Shakespeare, etc. Yeah, you know the point. The Western canon is what human civilization has produced best, and therefore other cultures' art cannot be put on par with the dialogues of Plato, with the plays of Shakespeare, with the music of Mozart, etc. So in short, racism. And this seems to be a Western phenomenon that started with the 18th century Europe, according to Tolstoy. Each European nation started to boast that its art isn't just the best that it can produce, but the best that all humanity can produce. Whites got used to regard naively as the best human race the Caucasian race. The English or Americans regard the Anglo-Saxon as the best human race. The Germans view the Germans as the best. The French, the Gallo-Latin race. The Russians, the Slavic race, etc. It is out of this racism that nations start looking at their art not as their art, but as the art of all humanity, which they now represent. And they represent the best and highest layers of it. And therefore, only their art is legit since it sprang from the purest race. When we speak of our art, as Tolstoy says, we are as fully convinced that it is not only true art, but is also the best and the only art. So this is apparently a new vision that didn't exist in pre-18th century Western nations, or perhaps wasn't widespread or accepted before the 18th century, but was already, around as early as the late Middle Ages or early Renaissance. And it didn't exist in the non-European nations. No one claimed that their art is the best art in all humanity. They were more concerned with making an art for the whole nation than an art, that can confirm their feelings of superiority over other races or nations. In other words, while they cannot claim that their art is the art of all humanity, that their art is the only art, they can claim that their art is totally theirs, whereas the Europeans, they cannot even claim that their art is that of Europe or of Christians, since Europe is predominantly Christian. More alarmingly, even the European nations themselves cannot claim that their art is the art of their nations. French aestheticians and artists cannot even claim that their art is French, that it's the art of the French nation. Instead, the art, boasted as the only art of all humanity is actually the art of a small elite circle that has nothing in common with the rest of the population that make the nations to which they claim to belong. As Tolstoy says, yet not only is our art not the only art, as the Bible used to be regarded as the only book, but it is not even the art of all Christian mankind, but just the art of a very small section of that part of mankind. It was possible to speak of Hebrew, Greek, or Egyptian national art, as it is now possible to speak of a Chinese, Japanese, or Indian art common to the whole nation. So that art of humanity cannot even be the art of just one nation, but of a more restricted circle whose art doesn't even do what it's supposed to do. Like how useless and pathetic can you be? Well, there's also that comment, not as the Bible used to be regarded as the only book. I guess when it comes to Christianity, it's suddenly fine to pretend that the book is the only right one. But I digress. When we look at how others produce art, we see that art is common to the whole nation, whereas in Europe, art has become common to just a small circle that thinks that they are better than anyone else, and everyone else. So this is an essential feature of art as manifestation of beauty. It is an art that claims universality, but is the art of just a small circle of privileged assholes. And this, for the first time, art within nations became divided between the art of the upper classes, claiming universality, and the art of the nation, denigrated as not real art. And we can say that this art isn't that of the nation because simply, the upper classes have cut themselves up from the nations. As Tolstoy says, since people of the upper classes of European society, having lost faith in the church teaching, did not embrace true Christianity and were left with no faith at all, it is no longer possible to speak of the art of the upper classes of Christian nations as if it were the whole of art. So we've explained that divide last week with the history of art as beauty, how the upper classes found themselves without a religious worldview, refusing to return to church Christianity, against which they rebelled, but also refusing to return to true Christianity since it requires to abandon their prestigious positions. Without any faith, they found themselves isolated from the rest of society, and it is there that art became about pleasure. The upper classes transformed art as an activity, no longer about infecting others with feelings, but just a source of pleasure. But since the rest of, the society they isolated from continue to be Christian, either following the church's Christianity or embracing true Christianity, since they don't have the same worldview as the upper classes, the art of the latter cannot communicate anything to the former. Since the former is the backbone of the nation, we're talking about the rest of society at large, art as beauty is just the art of a small circle that the backbone has to toil to produce for the amusement of the upper classes. And that's how art has been divided into two. Since the upper classes of the Christian nations lost their faith in church Christianity, their art has become separated from the art of the whole people, and there have been two arts: the art of the people and the art of the masters. So with this, Tolstoy can answer the question, how can humanity, which always lived with an art that infects others with feelings, find themselves, living with an art that serves pleasure, which is, like saying that humanity is now living without art. And the answer is, it wasn't humanity that, lives without true art, but just the European upper classes. It was not the whole of mankind that lived without true art, and not even a considerable part of it, but only the upper classes of European Christian society, and that only for a short period of time, from the beginning of the Renaissance and the Reformation to our own day. So it's a lifestyle that's just about 150 years old. And if it has, continued since then, it would be 250 years old. So it is still a recent and short period compared to the age of mankind. Alright then, what are the consequences of this divide between true art, art of the people, and fake art, that of the upper classes? Or more precisely, what are the consequences of a life without true art? There are first moral consequences for the upper classes themselves, which are the depravity of the class that avails itself of this art. So depravity means moral corruption, wickedness, or simply the absence of morals. Then you have consequences for art itself. That once we asserted as an indispensable truth, a claim that is striking in its obvious falseness, but is asserted nonetheless that the art of our upper classes is the whole of art, the only true universal art. So what are the consequences for art can you expect except a plethora of confused, incomprehensible theories of art, all the false and contradictory judgments of it, and above all, the self-confident stagnation of our art on its own erroneous path. So if the theories of art that keep, popping up are incomprehensible, it's not because they are false. It's not that the art on which they theorize is true art, but the aestheticians keep getting it wrong in their theories. No, the theories correspond to the art that they theorize. They are incomprehensible because the art itself is incomprehensible, because it is made with the intention of just pleasing. If all that art has to offer is pleasure, beauty, then it's not going to be comprehensible, and so the theories of that art are also going to be incomprehensible. And if that's, all that it has to offer, and the arrogance that comes with it, that this art is universal, then that art is never going to evolve. It can, change forms because, like any substance that provides pleasure, at one point it grows numb, and therefore you need to look for another substance to provide said pleasure. But switching to another drug or taking bigger doses cannot be called evolution or progress, but stagnation. Except here, it's a stagnation that, these classes are proud of. As a matter of fact, I'll explain what constitutes artistic progress in Tolstoy's definition. Anyway, so these are the consequences for art of these assertions that upper classes art is universal art, which definitely sounds like a dogma. And Tolstoy doesn't miss the opportunity to highlight how that assertion is perfectly identical with the assertions of religious people of various confessions who consider theirs the only true religion, and is perfectly arbitrary and clearly incorrect, yet it is calmly repeated by all people of our circle with complete confidence in its infallibility. And to highlight even more, the hypocrisy and the lulu of this class, and notably, start highlighting the consequences for the people of these assertions, Tolstoy says, ironically, the art we possess is the whole of art, the true, the only art, and yet not only do 2/3 of the human race, all the peoples of Asia and Africa, live and die without knowing this only true art, but furthermore barely 1% of all the people in our Christian society benefit from this art, which we call the whole of art. The remaining 99% of our European people live and die by generations, working hard without ever tasting this art, which besides is of such a kind that even if they could avail themselves of it, they would not understand anything. We, according to the aesthetic theory, we confess, recognize that art is either one of the highest manifestation of the idea of God, of beauty, or else is the highest spiritual pleasure. Besides that, we recognize that all people have equal rights, if not to material, at least to spiritual blessings. And meanwhile, 99% of our European people, generation after generation, live and die working hard at tasks necessary for the production of our art, from which they do not benefit. And even so, we calmly assert that the art we produce is the real, the one, the only, the whole of art. So there are the consequences for the rest of society. We've seen that the upper classes are depraved, that art, stagnates, and 3, if 1 or 2 weren't already bad, 2 can be, bad. Who gives a fuck about the moral status of the upper classes? Screw them. But 3 is about the people, the 99% who must live and die in extreme poverty and in constant labor to provide the 1% with the necessary conditions to enjoy their art. So not only must the working class labor day and night already just to satisfy their basic needs, because of course the resources invested in art have to be invested in art and not in making the working class's life conditions better or more bearable, but they also labor to satisfy the artistic desires of the upper classes. They must work to make their theaters, their costumes, their musical instruments, their canvases, their museums, their galleries, etc. But not even for the workers' enjoyment. It is the upper classes who get to enjoy this art. Only they have access to, the delights of 4-hour-long operas. They have the time, to have access to those delights. And so this is Tolstoy, most important claim. Those who work to produce that art, and they work hard for it, don't even benefit from the art. And even if they had access to it, if they could afford to buy, their seats at the opera theater, they wouldn't understand it. And it's not because they're idiots or lack knowledge, but as we said, because the art itself is incomprehensible. It's an art that brings nothing but pleasure, and only to a certain social class, which, by the way, not even all of its members enjoy the art, but they pretend to enjoy it just to fit within the upper classes, to be called a legit gentleman. So in contrast to this, Tolstoy asserts that if our art is the true art, all people ought to benefit from it. True art is art made for the people, not for an elite class that cannot even understand art beyond its, function to please. An art made just to please, just to manifest beauty, cannot benefit everyone, even if it were accessible. For something to please you aesthetically, it can be only conventional and narrowly conventional. It's not conventional on a national level, but only on a very restricted one, at the level of the codes of a small circle. For something to be commonly considered beautiful, that can only be within a small group that share the same pleasure, which is conditioned by the codes and tastes of their social class. Whereas when it comes to feelings, Tolstoy suggests that it is easier to infect others with the same feelings, and so you are more likely to unite people with feelings than with pleasure. What is beautiful to me isn't going to be beautiful to others unless we are from the same small group. But feelings transcend such boundaries, at least according to Tolstoy, and therefore they can spread through entire nations instead of just being confined to specific social groups. Sure, what a nation considers a good feeling isn't the same for another nation, as we already pointed, but we will address this relativism when it comes to feelings in due time. For now, let's just agree that infecting others with feelings is more efficient than trying to make people unite through pleasure. Unity was never the aim of the upper classes anyways. On the contrary, pleasure has always been a source for isolation than trying to get close to others. No wonder individualism and egoism are related to hedonism and the endless pursuit of pleasure. It always boils down to, prioritizing the self over the collective. But anyways, art is supposed to benefit everyone, not just a small group, and that benefit cannot be based on pleasure. I cannot say that art is beneficial to me because it gives me pleasure. But the upper classes make even stronger claims here. First, they don't say that beneficial art is an art that pleases us. They also say that some works of art are supposed to please us. Like, it's not just whatever, pleases you that is art. No, they say whatever pleases us should also please everyone else. If a work doesn't please us, it cannot please others. So whomever is pleased by the kind of art that we, the upper classes, don't find pleasing, they must be perverted or dumb. Like something is wrong with them. They cannot be fully humans. So they insert that only their art should be pleasing and the rest isn't art. So even if you agree that art is about beauty, it also needs to be about what the upper classes understand to be beauty. And so whenever someone doesn't enjoy their art, like the working classes, they'll object and say that if not all benefit from existing art, it is not the art that is to blame, but the wrong organization of society. But this is only when they don't pull the racist move and straight up blame the working class for being inferior and just stupid. But since, those same upper classes champion the doctrine of equal rights for everyone, except non-European nations, of course, they cannot really pull that move here. So they won't say workers, don't find our art beneficial, pleasing, or beautiful because they don't understand it, because they are stupid and inferior. Instead, they will say that it's the way society is organized. Society is organized in such a way that it obstructs the working classes to enjoy our art. They'll say that our art is for everyone, but unfortunately, we are organized in such a way that our art isn't reaching and touching everyone. And therefore, they go into speculation and start imagining utopias in which they get to keep their art, but now it is for everyone and everyone enjoys it, and thereby realizing the prophecy that their art is truly the one true universal art. They'll say that it is possible to imagine that in the future, physical labor will partly be replaced by machines, will partly be lightened by its proper distribution, that the work of producing art would be done in turns, that there is no need for the same people constantly to sit under the stage, moving the scenery, lifting machines, and playing on the piano, or the French horn, or setting type and printing books, and that those who do all that can work a smaller number of hours a day and in their free time benefit from all the blessings of art. So the problem is that the working classes simply don't have the time to enjoy the art that they produce for us. We make them work all the time to build our theaters, our art academies, our stages, our costumes, our canvases, our galleries, our museums, etc. And so they are too tired to understand Monet. It's not that Monet is trash, no, they just don't have the time to understand his genius. But if we make labor easier through machinery, then they will have the time to understand Monet, and you will see, they'll enjoy it. They will see that Monet or Van Gogh is beautiful, and then no one will ever doubt that what we make here in Europe is indeed the best art of all. So in short, the upper classes, they claim that, yes, for now, we are aware that this art for everyone, this whole of art that they produce, isn't accessible to all, and also, is predicated on slavery or slavery-like conditions, but don't worry, we'll find a way to make it compatible with our universal rights ideals. But Tolstoy's point is that this is all bullshit, because there is no other possible conditions for the production of this particular art than slavery. And he even suspects that the upper classes know it, but they are just gaslighting us because, what a shocker, upper classes like to remain, well, upper. So, as the anti-capitalist he is, Tolstoy writes that they, the upper classes, cannot be unaware that our refined art could emerge only on the slavery of the popular masses and can continue only as long as the slavery exists, and that the specialists, writers, musicians, dancers, and actors can reach that refined degree of perfection only on condition of the hard work of laborers, and that only on these conditions can there exist the refined public to appreciate such works. Free the slaves of capital, and it will be impossible to produce such refined art. Slay. So free the slaves of capital, and there won't be art as such. Because nothing can be produced to the satisfaction of the pleasure of privileged people when there is no capital, because there won't be privileged people. But let's concede, just for the sake of the argument, let's admit the inadmissible and pretend, that there can be methods to make it possible for all people to benefit from what is regarded as art among us. So let's pretend that it is true, and you can have upper-class art without slavery and everyone benefits from it, like everyone finds it beautiful. Well, you still run into another difficulty that shows why present-day art cannot be the whole of art. And that difficulty is, it is totally incomprehensible for the people. Hell, it's already incomprehensible for the upper classes themselves. They just pretend to understand what they watch, what they look at, or what they read, or what they listen. But let's concede here too, and pretend that the upper classes do understand whatever the fuck they are making and calling it art. It is true that for the common people, the vast majority of the masses, they don't understand what the upper classes are making. And who can blame them? As Tolstoy reminds us, poetic works were once written in Latin. And he's not talking about poetic works of ancient Rome, where Latin was the common language. No, he's talking about the early Renaissance, where Latin was only spoken by the upper classes. So naturally, if you stage plays or write novels and poetry in Latin, only those who understand the language can comprehend the work. But today, works of art are produced in the language of the common people, so they should be able to understand it. But as Tolstoy says, despite that, nowadays, works of art are as incomprehensible for the people as if they were written in Sanskrit, so a language even more far removed from the European masses than Latin. And again, Tolstoy isn't saying this like, the people are too dumb to comprehend that art, but that it is incomprehensible because, again, its aim is simply pleasure. Yet the art lovers quickly respond to Tolstoy with, the people don't understand it, but give them time and the right organization of society, and they will. They like to pull the move of, all the great artists and geniuses were first misunderstood. So they say, if the people do not understand our art now, it only proves that they are undeveloped, exactly as it has been with every new step in art. First, it was not understood, but later they got used to it. The same will happen with present-day art. It will become comprehensible when the people are as educated as the upper classes, the upper class people are who produce this art, say the defenders of our art. So, we have two assertions to save face. The first one is that production of upper-class art can be compatible with the doctrine of universal rights, so without slavery. And the second assertion is that with proper education, the people will understand upper-class art. And now, Tolstoy is going to debunk the second assertion more violently than he did the first one in this long-ass paragraph, starting with claiming that the second assertion is obviously still more incorrect than the first one. So let's see what is wrong with this assertion. We can start with the first reason. Tolstoy argues that if it were true that what was confined to the upper classes in terms of art got eventually democratized as time goes by, meaning that at first it was incomprehensible but then comprehensible to the masses, then we should find that the masses are already familiar with all works of art of the upper classes that preceded today's upper classes. For example, the masses wouldn't understand Monet, but would understand Botticelli. They may not understand Baudelaire, but they should certainly understand Racine, or Dante, or even Homer, since they were translated. They may not understand Pushkin, but they should be able to understand Molière, Sophocles, or Shakespeare. But it's not the case. These artists, they never became comprehensible to the masses. Even though I know that Shakespeare's plays were, also written and performed for the lower classes who gather around the stage at the pit or the grounding in old theaters. The point is, it is true that many works of art that are today considered refined and among the loftiest arts have been misunderstood at first. But that's only within the upper classes. It was incomprehensible and then comprehensible not to the masses, but to the upper classes. As Tolstoy reminds us, we know that the majority of upper-class works of art, such as various odes, narrative poems, dramas, cantatas, pastorals, paintings, and so on, which upper-class people admired in their time, have never afterwards been either understood or appreciated by the great masses, and have remained what they always were, an amusement for the wealthy people of their time, for whom alone they had any significance. From this, one can conclude that the same will happen with our art. I mean, given, the time that has passed, you would expect that some works of art, at least, painting or drama, would become appreciated by the masses. You can say that it is difficult for written works, since, illiteracy rates were quite high, but to look at a painting or to watch a play, all you need is just see and listen to people talk. So normally, if it were just a matter of education, by now, after centuries, at least some works of art would be given significance by the masses. But it seems that those works became comprehensible to only the upper classes. So it's not a matter of education. No matter how much you educate people into liking the shit, they won't. And it's also the same thing for the upper classes. If they like that art, it's not because they are educated, but because it gives them pleasure, and that pleasure is conditioned by their social classes. You can say that they were educated to appreciate that art, and so technically you can educate anyone into liking that art, but that's just a play on word because we confuse here education with conditioning. Educating, in that sense, simply means that you grow up, seeing your parents and authority figures acting like they enjoy and telling you that you have to enjoy it. They tell you that a good art should include references to classical mythology, for example. It must have a lot of symbolism. It must be, uncanny and filled with references, etc. So all you have to do is spot whatever you were told makes a good work of art, and that's it. Pleasure suddenly emerges. But that's not education, and you cannot force the masses into liking something that is so far removed from their existence anyways. The argument of the upper classes to prove that the people will in time come to understand our art is that if we just shove down our art down their throat, they will eventually get used to it and accept it as genuine art. They will say that it already happened with some works of so-called classical poetry, music, painting, with the masses, which the masses did not like at first, but they began to like later after these works were offered to them from all sides. Like, put our art in public spaces and they will eventually learn to like it. Make sure that wherever they go, they see our art. Put sculptures everywhere reminiscent of classical mythology. Erect beautiful buildings. Put ad signs about a free exhibition. Tell them they can attend art courses for free. Make sure that they have nowhere safe to hide from our art. And this is what educating means for the upper classes. They must force you into liking it because no one will like such art on their own. And they'd argue that even the mob, and a city mob, half corrupted to begin with, can always easily be made accustomed by perverting its taste to any art you like. And besides, this art is not produced by the mob and is not chosen by the mob, but is forcefully thrust upon it in those public places where it has access to art. So Tolstoy implies that even if they manage to make the mob accustomed to this art, that mob has to be at least half corrupted to begin with. Only with people who lack any concept of the good, or at least, wrestle with it, who are weak in front of their desires and pleasure, can this art take hold. So to say that with the right conditioning, you can make people accustomed to any art you like already suggests the moral bankruptcy of those who make and promote such art. They need to force it into public places because they know it's not a lack of education in the real sense that keeps people away from the art, even if it were, made materially accessible, but it's very content. So being able to convince you of the importance of its content, they have to resort to other means. They make you used to it, just like it was with them. So the second reason why the assertion is false, the content of art. For the vast majority of working people, our art, inaccessible to them because of its costliness, is also alien to them in its very content, conveying the feelings of people far removed from the conditions of laboring life led by the greatest part of mankind. That which constitutes pleasure for a man of the wealthy classes is not perceived as pleasure by working men, and calls up in him either no feelings at all, or else feelings completely contrary to those it calls up in an idle and satiated man. Satiated men. So in other words, the vast majority of mankind either have, other fish to fry besides the tragedies of Cassandra, or how King Lear descended into madness, or Dante's struggle to reach paradise, or the tragic fate of the young Werther. And even if you argue that the reason why they don't care about these things is because they have no time to enjoy it, since they are working all the time, but introduce machinery and they will be as idle as we are, even in that scenario, what makes you think that they will spend their time into your art specifically? You have already decided that art should manifest beauty and that only your art manifests beauty. And it's not uncommon for the masses, once they begin producing art that the upper classes don't find pleasing, they immediately meet resistance from the upper classes. Again, even with the hypothetical slave-free life, which doesn't mean, free like labor-free life, by the way. Let's agree on something. The masses aren't complaining because they labor, but because they are slaves or exist in slave-like conditions. The masses aren't looking for idleness. The ideal lifestyle will always be removed from the life led by the greater part of humanity because labor will always exist. The kind of art promoted by the upper classes is one that is compatible with an idle lifestyle, of a lifestyle not without slavery but without labor, which means that they still require slaves. And there won't be a world in which machines replace completely human labor, and even then you have to assume that men aren't competing with the machines replacing them. But I digress. So even if we don't have slaves anymore, that doesn't mean that the masses, now free from slavery, will appreciate your art and confirm your assertion that your art is the best there is, or that this is the whole of art. Okay, they'd still look at Monet or Moreau and go like, what the fuck am I supposed to feel? Who gives a fuck about Zeus and simile and the 100,000 symbols in Moreau's paintings? Why would you think that the masses will turn to your art if they had more free time and not produce works of art that, don't fit with your art? Even if they value art for pleasure, like we said, the criterion of pleasure means nothing. You'll just have, more movements of art, each competing with the others and trying to claim that they have achieved the quintessence of art. And move only, a small circle of followers each, just like, religious sects, religions and their countless denominations. So if we go with the beauty principle, you only get more conflict and further isolation. Like you literally atomize society even more by creating more smaller groups, each claiming that their art is the one supposed to please everyone. And if you go with the feeling doctrine, either the masses won't feel anything regarding your art or feel scorn and contempt. Suppose that you want the masses to have specific feelings such as honor, patriotism, and amorousness, which constitutes the main content of present-day art. Like most upper-class art is trying to move the masses with those particular feelings. However, these are upper-class values that only disgust working men. They call up in working men only perplexity, scorn, or indignation. First, because they don't, care, and secondly, because they are because their values, they are values used to justify exploitation, to justify exploiting working men and further dividing societies rather than uniting them. Yes, and especially patriotism. However, honor. Said however, honor here means dueling. Which was still customary among the higher circles in Russia, as in other continental countries when Tolstoy was writing this book. So it's not just honor in the broad sense, but in the sense that men are willing to kill one another for honor, which basically means their ego. And by the way, that's from Odd's translation in a footnote about the word honor. As for amorousness, it means the taste of being strongly in love or lusting for someone sexually, or romantic passion, which only make, working men cringe. So Tolstoy's point is that it's not just that working classes lack the time to educate themselves. Even if we accept the absurd claim that you can produce that art without turning the masses into slaves, the problem still lies in the content of the art itself. You will never convince the masses that this is genuine art because the religious consciousness, remember that concept from last week's episode, the religious consciousness, meaning that is what is considered an ideal. So the religious consciousness of the upper classes, which is idleness, has nothing in common with the religious consciousness of the working classes of the vast majority of mankind. So as Tolstoy says, so even if the majority of working people were given the opportunity in their time of in the time of labor, to see, to read, to hear, as they do sometimes in the cities, in picture galleries, popular concerts, books, all that constitutes the flower of present-day art. These working people, to the extent that they are working people and do not yet belong partly to the category of those perverted by idleness, would understand nothing of our refined art. And even if they did, the greater part of what they understood would not only not elevate their souls, but would corrupt them. So that for sincere and thinking people, there can be no doubt that the art of the upper classes can never become the art of the whole people. So in short, it's not just inaccessible because of its material cost, but also because of its content. The kind of art produced for just the aim of being beautiful and pleasing can never ever be accessible and will never be comprehensible. And even if it were comprehensible, it will just harm people more, because the only thing to understand here is that pleasure is the measure of good and evil, which would be a catastrophe for society's well-being. And all evil, we justified on that basis. So if art is indeed an important thing, a spiritual blessing, as necessary for all people as religion, as admirers of art like to say, it must then be accessible to all people. And given that this particular art isn't, it can neither be important, necessary, nor a spiritual blessing. He says, and if it cannot become art for all people, then one of the two things: either art is not as important as it is made out to be, or the art which we call art is not important. So that is the insoluble dilemma that the upper classes face. either you make an art that is accessible to the people, but lose an art based on pleasure and therefore your privileges, or keep that art but deny its access to the masses. In short, either you keep an art whose sole purpose is to please but requires slavery, or you abandon slavery but lose that art in the process. And I think you can guess which option the upper classes will choose, right? Obviously the upper classes, since an art with the sole purpose to please cannot aim for the good, and for an art to be this widespread, then the whole class must have, already accepted it and embraced it, so they are already morally bankrupt. They are going to choose the first option, keep slavery. Being intelligent but immoral people, they boldly resolve the dilemma by denying one side of it, namely the right of the popular masses to benefit from art. So they will try to make it accessible, but once they see that they cannot go on with the charade, they will straight up turn fascist and discard their talk of human rights and universal equality altogether. Now they will say straight up and straight away and openly that despite trying everything, the people will never be able to comprehend our art, and so the only option is to regard them as really inferior and unworthy of beauty. Their existence can have no other purpose but to serve our taste. So now their doctrine is now openly, fully and unashamedly endorsed for what it really is, without even the pretending in universal art. No, now they admit that this is the art of the upper classes only. It's not universal, it's not for everyone, but just for the high club, who stand at the pinnacle of humanity. The art of the upper classes, indeed. So he says, only the Schöne Geister, the elect as the romantics call them, or the supermen as they have been called by Nietzsche's followers, can partake of and benefit from the supremely beautiful in their understanding. That is the loftiest pleasure of art. The rest, the crude herd, unable to experience these pleasures, must serve the lofty pleasures of this higher race of men. Those who voice such views at least do not pretend and do not want to combine the uncombinable, but admit directly what happens to be the case, namely, that our art is the art of the upper classes only. This essentially is how art has been and is understood by all people occupied with the arts of in our society. So that's it for the eighth chapter. Moving on to the 9th chapter now, we get more details about the specificities of art as manifestation of beauty. We've seen that such art is incompatible with the ideals of equality. That's perhaps the most distinctive feature. But now we need to analyze it in more details. So a brief recap. Normally art is an activity whose aim should be, as it always was until the 18th century, to convey the loftiest feelings mankind has attained to in its religious consciousness. So art is a means of communicating feelings, and the loftiest the feeling, the greater the art. By loftiest here, he means what the religious consciousness of the people deems to be good. A feeling is good or lofty if it promotes the good, the ideal set by religious consciousness. So far, humankind was divided into different nations and civilization, each promoting a certain good, and therefore different feelings were promoted in art depending on the nations. But if art is supposed to be unifying, then there is no reason to just stop at just, the unification of nations and civilizations, but aim at the unity of all mankind. Therefore, an art that conveys the loftiest feelings that mankind has attained is an art that unites all mankind. And that was supposed to be the aim of art. But once the European upper classes lost their religious beliefs, only embraced a Christianity just for show, to maintain their privileges and their social positions, art was no longer about conveying feelings, let alone the loftiest feelings, but was replaced by an activity whose with the aim of which was to afford the greatest pleasure to a certain group of people, and from the whole vast area of art, that alone which affords pleasure to people of a certain circle has been singled out and has come to be called art. So we've seen we've seen this just a moment ago with how some aestheticians of the upper classes proclaim not just that their art is all art, meaning that if other people from other classes or other nations produce works of art, that won't be recognized as art, but they even now stand by the position that only the upper classes should make art, and an art whose purpose is just to please them and only them. In short, all of art now exists for the only purpose of pleasing the upper classes, and only the upper classes can produce art. In the previous chapter, we outlined some consequences of this shift from art based on conveying feelings to art based on providing pleasure. We said that there were consequences on the upper classes themselves, on the masses, and also on art itself, that it stagnates. Here we are going back to that stagnation, because Tolstoy didn't say much about it in the 8th chapter. Also, there are consequences on society as a whole that needs to be addressed. More precisely, moral consequences for European society, and by extension, any society that adopts the same views of the upper classes. So what results from singling out from the whole area of art and bestowing importance upon an art not deserving of such evaluation? Well, art becomes sterile and stagnates. If its aim has always been to convey feelings, if already you're restricted to just one class, like only a small group of people can make art, well, art becomes defined as the means for the communication of feelings of the upper classes. The rest of society can no longer convey their feelings, since the means to do so now belongs to the upper classes. Three results occurred. First, art will lose its diversity, and it will lose its richness. The less people participate in art, the fewer the feelings conveyed through art, and therefore the poorer the art. Second, and perhaps more ironically, art loses beauty. And thirdly, art becomes a simulacra, a copy or imitation of art. And this perversion of art weakened art itself and drove it almost to ruin. The first consequence was that art lost the infinitely diverse and profound religious content proper to it. The second consequence was that, having only a small circle of people in mind, it lost beauty of form, became fanciful and unclear, and the third and chief consequence was that it ceased to be sincere and became artificial and cerebral. So this chapter will focus on the first consequence, and then chapter 10 and 11 focus on the second and third consequence respectively. So let's begin with the first consequence. Art loses the richness of its content, or impoverishment of content. So here we need to be precise. Art, true art, doesn't just reproduce feelings already spread through society. It has a creative component. It's it more importantly conveys a new feeling not experienced by people before. So it doesn't just reproduce feelings, but introduce new feelings. Art then is analogous to ideas. An idea, or a product of thinking, can only be called that, a product of thinking, when it conveys new observations and thoughts and does not repeat what is already known. So making art is the same as thinking. Thinking isn't valued for repeating what's already known, but for building on what is already known or bringing in new knowledge, etc. We say that an idea is the product of thinking when it is new, when it allows people to grasp, concepts and things that they never suspected or weren't even seeing before. And art is no different. If the most valued ideas are not ideas that repeat other ideas, but new ideas, then works of art are no different. In exactly the same way, a work of art is only a work of art when it introduces a new feeling, however insignificant, into the general usage of human life. So, thinking introduces new ideas, while art introduces new feelings. So, just like you can value someone's thinking by its content, meaning new ideas, if someone brought new ideas, then we know that we know that person truly thinks, and so the same holds for art. We know that art is true art by the feelings it introduces. If it's a new feeling, then it is a true work of art. So that's why Tolstoy argues that art works best on children and adolescents. Since the young are, young, there is so much that they didn't experience yet, including feelings. And so works of art convey to them for the first time feelings that they have not experienced before. And so that's what makes true art so rich and in constant progression. People are so diverse that there is never enough art to convey all the feelings, including new feelings, that they go through. And of course, this also affects adults. It's probably easier for art to strongly affect children, since adults probably already experienced more feelings than kids. The difficulty with adults is perhaps to find new feelings to introduce to them, but the principle remains the same. If the feeling is new, it will always strongly affect anyone, kid or adult. A completely new feeling, never before experienced by anyone, has a similarly strong effect upon adults. So feelings guarantee that art remains innovative and resourceful, but for art to maintain that diversity of feelings, it needs a framework of assessing feelings that also guarantees that we will get to express and convey as much as possible. And that framework, however, has to be religious consciousness that strive for the good. Good feelings are feelings that get us closer to the good, to the unity of mankind, while bad feelings get us further away. But it's in the promotion of unity that we are sure of always enjoying that diversity of feeling, even as, even at just a spatio-temporal level. Even if it is just the religious consciousness of a particular people at a particular time. Nothing produces feelings more abundantly than the quest for unity, with bonding with other human beings. But if you start evaluating feelings not according to religious consciousness, but by the degree of pleasure they afford, just like the upper classes have done, then art deprived itself of the source of these feelings. So replacing the good by pleasure as a framework to evaluate everything, including feelings, leads art to stagnate. There is nothing new anymore but a desperate pursuit of pleasure, repeating again and again at higher doses, and when we are looking for a new pleasure, it's just to ward off boredom. As Tolstoy says, there is nothing older or more hackneyed than pleasure, and there is nothing newer than the feeling that emerged from the religious consciousness of a particular time. And it could not be otherwise. A limit is set to immense pleasure by nature, but mankind's movement forward, which is expressed by religious consciousness, has no limits. With each step forward that mankind takes, and these steps are made through an ever-increasing clarification of religious consciousness, people experience more and more new feelings. And therefore, it is only on the basis of religious consciousness, which reveals the highest degree of understanding of life attained by the people over a certain period, that there can emerge new feelings never before experienced by men. So thus, a new feeling is giving to works of art, even those that are championed by the upper classes themselves, but belong to an older time. The Greeks, for example, which the upper classes completely misunderstands by attributing to them a science of aesthetics, they also produced an art that conveys, new feelings in the history of mankind. It's not that Tolstoy is saying that you shouldn't read the Greeks, like, there's nothing that Homer or Sophocles can teach a working man. The working man doesn't care about, the upper classes who claim that they want Greek art to be accessible to all, want the working man to just be pleased by the art, just, to take in its beauty instead of understanding the feelings of the Greeks. But to understand the feelings of people who lived thousands of years before us, that requires that we too produce the kind of art that conveys our feelings. The history of art for Tolstoy is the history of the feelings of mankind. How can the working man understand the feelings of the Greeks if he has no medium to convey his own feelings? It's like, there is a gap in the records of humanity when the upper classes decided that art should be about pleasure only. For at least 2 centuries now, we are losing feelings and obstructing the religious consciousness of so many people and also peoples. That's what, should be taken from the Greeks, the content of their religious consciousness. The new and infinitely diverse feelings important for the Greeks expressed by Homer and the tragedians, what feelings they considered good and which ones they considered bad, not just how pleasing it is to watch Oedipus Rex. So according to Tolstoy, that should be the takeaway from all works of art that belong to ancient or order societies. Even sacred texts are included here. If you read the Bible or, for example, the Quran, it's about unburying the feelings that those people experienced and valued. The Old Testament, for example, should be read to know the feelings of the Jews who attained to the religious consciousness of monotheism, and this consciousness also produced all the new and important feelings expressed by the prophets. So when you go through medieval art and literature, the same applies. What feelings were important for medieval men who believed in the church community and the heavenly hierarchy? And it is the same for the men of our time who has adopted the religious consciousness of true Christianity, the consciousness of the brotherhood of men. So that's the unity of mankind, which is the ideal of true Christianity. And we will get to that. So when art does what it's supposed to do, convey feelings, it will involve, each people will express new feelings and so on and so forth. So the takeaway is the diversity of feelings produced by religious consciousness is infinite, and they are all new because religious consciousness is nothing other than the indication of the new creative attitude of men towards the world, while the feelings arising from the desire for pleasure are not only limited but have long since been experienced and expressed. And therefore the unbelief of the European upper classes led them to an art most poor in content. But not only that, it's not just that pleasure expresses nothing new, but even if the upper classes want to convey feelings through art, being cut off from the rest of society, art becomes only about conveying the feelings of the upper classes, which in terms of feelings, has to be, the poorest class. In other words, the upper classes have only a handful of feelings compared to the rest of society, especially the working classes. And so the range of feelings, even if we admit that they are genuine feelings, gets restricted even more. So the impoverishment of the content of upper class art, as Tolstoy says, was increased by the fact that having ceased to be religious, it also ceased to be popular, thereby diminishing still further the range of feelings it conveyed, since the range of feelings experienced by the ruling, wealthy men who do not know the labor that maintains life is much smaller, poorer, and more insignificant than the range of feelings of working people. So a working man will always have more feelings to convey than the most educated men from the upper classes. And not just that, but even the quality of those feelings is better when they come from working people. The loftiest feeling, like that we mentioned, those who guarantee, higher chances at unifying mankind, are feelings of those who know the labor that maintains life, because they're the ones doing that labor. And of course, aestheticians of the upper classes, they like to deny this and attempt desperately to make the bold claim that their class offers more feelings and loftier feelings than the working classes. Tolstoy mentions Ivan Goncharov, a Russian novelist, and he was a mentor and also a rival of Turgenev. He is another famous novelist, the guy who wrote Fathers and Sons, and accused him of plagiarizing his ideas and obstructed his chances at European fame. So this guy, an intelligent, educated man, though a thorough city dweller and an aesthetician, told him that Turgenev captured so well the life of the people in his writings, notably the Hunter's Notes, also titled A Sportsman's Sketches, which is a cycle of short stories, the first to earn Turgenev fame in Russia. So Goncharov, he told Tolstoy that, in Turgenev, there was nothing left to write about the life of the people. It was all set up. The life of laboring people seemed so simple to him that after Turgenev's story of the people, there was nothing left to describe. All right, maybe so. The life of the working man is, limited in content, whereas that of the wealthy, with its love affairs and self-dissatisfactions, seem to him full of infinite content. So, for this guy, for this intelligent and educated man, one hero kissed his lady's palm, another her elbow, a third in some other place, one languishes from laziness, another because he is unloved. This seemed to him there was no end of diversity in this area. So this is a common opinion in the upper classes, that the life of laboring people is poor in content, while our life, the life of idle people, is full of interesting things. But nothing can be further removed from the truth. I mean, let's compare. We start with the life of a working man. Tolstoy says, the life of a working man, of the laboring man, with its infinite diverse forms of labor and the dangers connected with it on the sea or under the ground, with its travels, dealings with the proprietors, superiors, comrades, with people of other confessions and nationalities, his struggle with nature, wild animals, his relations with domestic animals, his labors in the forest, the steppe, the fields, the orchard, the kitchen garden, his relation with his wife and children, not only as close and dear people, but as co-workers, helpers, replacements in his work, his relation to all economic questions, not as subjects of discussion or vanity, but as questions vital for himself and his family, with his pride in self-sufficiency and service to others, with his pleasure in time off, and all these interests pervaded by a religious attitude towards these phenomena. So compare this with the life of an idle man from the upper classes now, and tell which one is richer. Think of all the feelings that working people can convey if they were making art, or if their art was as valued and admired as that of upper classes. Sure, from the point of view of the upper classes and Tolstoy's circles, who have no such interests in and no religious understanding, this life seems monotonous. But if that's true, then you would expect the life of an idle man to be more resourceful in providing a variety of feelings. So let's see what a life of an idle gentleman is about. Small pleasures and insignificant cares, not of labor and creativity, but of the use and destruction of what others have made for us. So you can say that Tolstoy is biased towards the upper classes, but honestly, fuck them. I'm all with Tolstoy. So yes, nothing is more devoid of interest and filled with boredom than the life of a gentleman. And yet the upper classes think that the feelings experienced by people of our own time and circle are very significant and diverse. However, Tolstoy points that the feelings of the upper classes, if art is to convey them, are actually just three feelings. All feelings are derivative of these three very insignificant and uncomplicated feelings: the feeling of pride, sexual lust, and the tedium of living. So earlier we mentioned honor, patriotism, and amorousness. Those can be boiled down to the feelings of pride, sexual lust, and boredom, or a mixture of these feelings. Amorousness is obviously a feeling of sexual lust, but can also be motivated by boredom. Patriotism of pride and honor can be both boredom and pride. So these are the feelings that make up almost exclusively the contents of the art of the wealthy classes. That's it. Just measly three feelings make the whole content of what this class of intelligent and educated men is able to produce. So Tolstoy suggests that the first feeling to emerge in this class and took over their art was pride. So at the very beginning of the separation of upper class art from popular art, pride became the chief feeling conveyed through art. That time of separation, we already explained how it happened during the end of the Middle Ages, so it was during the Renaissance that it started. We've seen that in episode 2 about the history of, the theory of art as a manifestation of beauty. And art then got as its chief subject the praise of the powerful, the popes, the kings, the dukes. Odes, madrigals, cantatas, hymns were written in their praise. Their portraits were painted, their statues were sculpted, glorifying them in various ways. Sexual lust was the second feeling that came at a later point, but shortly after. And it gained more and more ground in art to the point where it became, with very few exceptions, and in novels and dramas with no exceptions, the necessary condition of every work of art of the wealthy classes. Now, sexual lust must be everywhere in art. Almost as if, a work of art that lacks any element to convey the feeling of sexual lust is unworthy of being called work of art. And Tolstoy has more to say about this in subsequent chapters. Then arrived the feeling of the tedium of living. So this one, Tolstoy argues, began to appear at the beginning of the present century only by exceptional people. Byron, Leopardi, and later Heine, but has recently become fashionable and is now expressed by the most banal and ordinary people. Here's a quote from René Doumic, a French critic, from an essay he wrote in 1896 entitled Les Jeunes, Études et Portraits, so the young, studies and portraits. And this is about boredom. So, c'est la lassitude de vivre, le mépris de l'époque présente, le regret d'un autre temps aperçu à travers l'illusion de l'art, le goût du paradoxe, le besoin de se singulariser, une aspiration de raffiner vers la simplicité, l'adoration enfantine du merveilleux, la séduction maladive de la rêverie, l'ébranlement des nerfs, surtout l'appel exaspéré de la sensualité. So, translation, it is the weariness with life, the scorn of the present age, the longing for another time perceived through the illusion of art, the taste for paradox, the need to make oneself noticed, the aspiration of the refined towards simplicity, the infantile worship of the marvelous, the morbid seductiveness of reverie, the unsettling of the nerves, and above all, the exasperated appeal of sensuality. So I think that speaks for itself, and Tolstoy considers sensuality, sexual lust, as the worst of the three feelings because it is accessible not only to all people but also to all animals. So it's a feeling that reduces humans to animals, to their basic instinct, to the lowest kind of pleasure. And yet, out of the three, it is, the one that is dominating in all works of art in modern times. He says, from Boccaccio to Marcel Prévost, all novels, narrative poems, and lyrics inevitably convey feelings of sexual love in its various form. Adultery is not just the favorite, but the only theme of all novels. A performance is not a performance unless women, bared above or below, appeared in it under some pretext. Ballads, songs, all these express lust with various degrees of poeticizing. The majority of paintings by French artists portray female nakedness in various forms. There is hardly a page or a poem in the new French literature without a description of nakedness or the use here and there, appropriately or inappropriately, of the favorite word and notion nu, meaning nude. So he also goes on rambling about Rémy de Gourmont, considered the most authoritative critic of the symbolist group and who Tolstoy apparently recently discovered. He is a contemporary of Tolstoy, and he read his novel Les Chevaux de Diomedes, so Diomedes' Diomedes' Mares, published in 1897, so not to confuse with The Horses of Diomedes by Agatha Christie. That's another novel. And it refers to Greek mythology, more specifically to Heracles, or Hercules' eighth labor. You know the story, Heracles was assigned to complete 12 labors by his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns. tyrants, not sure of the pronunciation, I forgot how it is pronounced. So he was assigned these labors to complete, to atone for some horrible deeds that he committed. I mean, he killed his own wife, Megara, and their kids because he was hallucinating and he thought that they were monsters attacking him. And it was orchestrated by Hera, by the way, by the goddess Hera. So she put a spell on him so that he saw, his wife and kids turn into monsters and attacking him. And so he killed them, believing that they were monsters. So one of the labors he had to do was to tame Diomedes' mares. So Diomedes was another king, king of Thrace, and he had mares, female horses, and these horses, they eat human flesh, and Heracles was supposed to steal those horses. So, like any symbolist at that time, Gourmand uses a lot of references to Greek mythology, and as he reads his novel, Tolstoy was just impressed. He says, "This is an unbroken, detailed description of the sexual relations some gentlemen had with various women. Not a page is without lust-arousing descriptions. It is the same with Pierre Louis' successful book Aphrodite, and the same with another book I recently came across, Certains by Huysmans. Which is supposed to be a criticism of painters. It is the same with the rarest exceptions in all French novels. These are all works by people suffering from erotic mania." So no need to know who these writers are, Tolstoy just mentioned them as examples, but the literature is filled with similar examples of people suffering from this erotic mania and who generalize their suffering to the rest of humanity. Because they suffer from this mania, and because they are upper class, so they must assume that this is the best experience of mankind. These people, he says, apparently convinced that since their entire life, as a result of their morbid condition, is concentrated on the smearing about sexual abominations, it must mean that the entire life of the world is concentrated on the same thing, and the entire artistic world of Europe and America imitates these people suffering from erotic mania. And so as a result of the unbelief of and the exclusive life of the upper classes, the art of these classes became impoverished in content and was all reduced to the conveying of the feelings of vanity, tedium of living, and above all, sexual lust. So that's for the first consequence on art. It's impoverishment. Art is reduced to just conveying those three base feelings. Okay, so now we can move on to the 10th chapter with the second consequence. Art loses beauty, ironically. Okay, so this is a long chapter, notably because Tolstoy gives many examples and quotes here. I don't think we'll go through all of them because we are already over an hour, and to get to the 11th chapter, we are at least looking at 2 hours. At least. So we'll try to speed it up a little bit. So far, we just went through the first consequence, that through art of these people became poor in content. So he says art of the people because given that the art of the upper classes being already too poor, almost vacuous in content, by proclaiming itself to be the whole of art, it discourages and even prohibits the people from making their art. So popular art becomes devalued and ultimately it leads to its impoverishment. But the second consequence of the unbelief of the upper classes is that by making art more and more exclusive, it became at the same time more and more complex, fanciful, and unclear. And so this is perhaps the most important claim by Tolstoy in opposition to the elitism of the upper classes regarding art. The upper classes, they seem to assume that the less clear a work of art is, the better the quality, because it suggests that only a minority of learned individuals can understand it and thereby assert their dominance. But Tolstoy thinks otherwise. The more unclear your art is, the less art it is. He says, when an artist of the whole people, such as Greek artists or the Jewish prophets once were, created his works, he naturally strove to say what he had to say in such fashion that his work would be understood by all people. But when an art is created for a small circle of people who lived in exceptional conditions, or even for one person and his courtiers, for a pope, a cardinal, a king, a duke, a queen, a king's mistress, he naturally sought only to influence these people who were known to him and who lived in certain conditions with which he was familiar. So indeed, it would be weird to think that Homer wrote his epics in ways that he knew that only a small minority of privileged aristocrats would understand them. Rather, he aimed at being understood by the whole Greek world. It's the same with the prophets. When they address men in their prophecies and sermons, they don't speak in riddles, actually. They speak in ways that cannot be misunderstood. I mean, even when they give, riddles or analogies, let's say, or allegories, they do it in a way that they know that most people will understand them. And sure, a common Greek and a common Jew may not understand what the other artists are saying or trying to convey, but they simply depend on how broad the feeling is supposed to be. Are the Greek artists trying to unite the Greek world, or only the whole of humanity with their hymns, epics, and dramas? Well, in either way, it remains inconceivable for them to make their art with the claim that only an elite few would be able to understand it. So even church Christianity, with their far-fetched doctrines of the Trinity, a virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, the heavenly hierarchies, etc., while this clearly has elements of an elitist class interpreting scriptures for the masses, it didn't go as far as breaking up with the people and proclaiming them incapable of understanding the art that the church was manufacturing for them. No artist of church Christianity felt that he'll be misunderstood by the people to whom he presents his artwork, contrary to the post-church Christian upper classes, which no longer bothered to reach the masses. And as such, the artists of the upper classes, they no longer bothered with the effort to make themselves clear and intelligible. On the contrary, they were brought up in a circle in which incomprehensiveness is valued as a sign of genius, and in which art is not for the masses, but for their peers. So it's not the masses that get to be the judges of the artist's works and feelings, but the members of the artist's circles. And hence, good art is no longer understood by the masses, but by a very small circle, itself in competition with other circles. So all the conditions are set to push the artist involuntarily towards expressing himself in allusions unclear to everyone else and comprehensible only to the initiate. So the upper classes have made it so that every time feelings are called up, their expression has to be incomprehensible for the masses. The artists themselves are then trapped. Whenever they have feelings to express, they find themselves able to express them in ways that only their elite circle can understand, if indeed they understand them. Given that the only feelings they understand are those of pride, lust, and boredom, an artist is forced to only express those feelings, even if he himself doesn't feel them. But whatever feelings they want to express, if they have any, in what way can they express them? So first, Tolstoy is going to provide the devices that artists use to express their feelings in ways that they know the work will only be understood by their circle. And secondly, he even adds that this manner of expression contained within itself, even for the initiate, a certain special charm of obscurity. So that means that both artists and initiates, the target audience, they feel a certain pleasure in the fact that the work is incomprehensible. Obscurity has a charm, apparently, so let's see what artists use to express their feelings in this setting. So their favorite device, their favorite devices seem to consist entirely of euphemisms, mythological and historical allusions. So vagueness and plays on words that only their circle might understand. So these artists express themselves almost exclusively through private jokes and allusions to history and mythology that most people won't understand. And as Tolstoy argues, this manner of expression came into use more and more and seems to have reached its extreme limits recently in so-called decadent art. Recently, not only have vagueness, mysteriousness, obscurity, and inaccessibility to the masses been considered a merit and a condition of the poeticality of artistic works, but so too have imprecision, indefiniteness, and ineloquence. So here he targets the decadent movement specifically. It's mostly based in France, and its leading figures were Baudelaire, Verlaine, Mallarmé, and Théophile Gautier, the author of the phrase art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art. Like the symbolists, these took imprecision to its extreme, even openly calling for obscurity and ineloquence. They're also known for constantly throwing in sexual themes in their works, precisely as a rejection of eloquence. They like subversion for the sake of subversion. According to Gautier, in his preface to Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, Baudelaire rid his poetry as far as possible of eloquence, passion, and a too exactly copied truth. Donc, so l'éloquence, la passion et la vérité calquée trop exactement. So they reject the mimesis doctrine that art should copy reality. That's what is meant by too exactly copied truth. Like art tries to reproduce truth to the T. Instead, art should be about fantasy and dreamlike, even obscene and nightmarish. Art should shock and bewilder. It shouldn't soothe or smooth, but puzzle and disturb. So basically, sex and obscurity. And Tolstoy adds that Baudelaire himself expressed that goal when he, when you read his poetry, especially his Petit Poème en prose, he says that the meaning of which must be puzzled out like a rebus, and the majority of which remain unriddled. So that's his second famous work, but it's often translated as Le Spleen de Paris, which is a collection of about 50 poems, but written in prose, and they are even more obscure than his poems written in verse, like regular poems in Les Fleurs du Mal. Then he quotes Paul Verlaine, a follower of Baudelaire, from his Art Poétique, which is an introduction manual to on how to write poetry, written as a poem, and it is from his poem collection Jadis et Naguère, so long ago and recently, published in 1884. So here's Verlaine's advice on how to choose your words. So these are the opening and closing stanzas of the poem. So for him, poems must be written like music. So he says, de la musique avant toute chose, et pour cela préfère l'impair, plus vague et plus sombre, plus soluble dans l'air, sans rien en lui qui pèse ou qui pose. Il faut aussi que tu n'ailles point choisir tes mots sans quelque méprise, rien de plus cher que la chanson grise où l'indécis au précis se joint. And further on, de la musique encore et toujours, que ton vers soit la chose envolée, qu'en sang qui fuit d'une âme en allée, vers d'autres cieux, à d'autres amours, que ton vers soit la bonne aventure, éparse au vent crispé du matin, qui va fleurant la menthe et le thym, et tout le reste est littérature. So, translation, music first of all, and for that prefer the uneven. So what's the uneven? No one fucking knows. And that uneven is more vague and more soluble in air, with nothing in it that weighs or drags. And you also must not go choosing your words without a certain disdain. Nothing's more precious than a tipsy song where indistinct is joined to precise. So literally he's telling you that the most precise songs are the tipsy ones. The speech of a drunk man is clearer than that of a sober man. Like, choose your words as if you were drunk. And then he goes on, music again and always, let your verse be that winged thing that one feels fleeing from a parting soul towards other loves in other skies. Let your verse be the lucky chance scattered on the tense morning wind that goes sniffing at mint and thyme, and all the rest is literature. So basically, he's one of those poets for whom, as long as it rhymes, it's fine. But perhaps no one put it more clearly than Mallarmé, and I know it's very paradoxical, it's ironic to say that they wrote things clearly. So Mallarmé is one of the most important of the group, who says directly that the charm of a poem consists in having to guess its meaning, that there should always be some riddle in a poem. So I'm just going to read the translation of the quote because it's too long. So it's a quote from a response by Mallarmé to a French essayist about the evolution of literature. So this is the translation. I think there should be nothing but illusion. The contemplation of objects, the fleeting image of the reveries they call up, are the song. The Parnassians, for their part, take the thing as a whole and display it. As a result, they lack mystery. They deprive our minds of the delicious joy of believing that they are creating. To name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the poet's enjoyment, which is made from the happiness of divining little by little. Suggestion, that is the dream. It is the perfect use of this mystery that constitutes the symbol. To evoke an object little by little and release a state of soul from it by a series of decipherments. If a person of average intelligence and insufficient literary preparation chances to open a book made in this way and tries to enjoy it, there is a misunderstanding. Things must be put back in their place. There must always be enigma in poetry, and that is the aim of literature. There is no other, the evocation of objects. So the italic is Tolstoy's. So this is, the main teaching of modern art. Obscurity is made a dogma, as the French critic Dumic, who has yet to recognize the truth of this dogma, quite correctly says, il serait temps aussi de finir avec cette fameuse théorie de l'obscurité que la nouvelle école a élevée en effet à la hauteur d'un dogme. So translation from Dumic, same reference as earlier, by the way. It is also time we were done with this famous theory of obscurity that the new school has in fact raised to the level of a dogma. So this dogma of obscurity isn't just, a French phenomenon, but it can be found in all other nations and in all forms of art. Germans, Scandinavians, Italians, Russians, and the Englishmen, all modern artists in all branches of art think in the same way, in painting, in sculpture, and in music. So all are elitists who believe that only a handful of learned and enlightened men can understand their genius, and therefore art should solely be made for the elevated few, not the uneducated masses. So, guided by Nietzsche and Wagner, artists of modern times think that there is no need for them to be understood by the crude masses, that it is enough for them to evoke poetic stances in the best nurtured men, to use the expression of one English aesthetician. So at note 60, the translator points that Tolstoy misquoted that phrase, the best nurtured men, from Grant Allen, the English aesthetician, with the theory that art came from play, from the extra energy that we got left once we satisfied our needs. We mentioned him in the first episode in chapter 3. So anyways, back to Tolstoy. So he keeps providing examples, focusing on the French again, because they express the new trend in art more clearly, and the majority of Europeans imitate them. So you have the list here of symbolists, decadents, and the magi, the followers of Baudelaire and Verlaine, like here they are. This is it. I'm not going to name them, but here they are. So Dumic added actually 141 more writers on top of these in his book surveying the literary landscape of the time. And Tolstoy then goes back to giving samples from Baudelaire, Verlaine, Mallarmé, and another contemporary poet, Maurice Maeterlinck. But we're not going through the extract because they're long and in French, and I don't want to read them and then the translation that take a long time. But I don't know, maybe I'll do a whole video dedicated to them and the first appendix. I'm not sure though. The first appendix is just 5 pages of more samples of obscure poetry. And a few pages later, Tolstoy encourages the reader to read the appendix to be fully sure that Tolstoy isn't exaggerating when he says that these guys are just, full of shit. So here's the passage. I ask the reader not to be lazy about reading the examples that I cite in the first appendix from the better known and esteemed young poets, Griffin, Régnier, Moréa, and Montesquieu. So that's Robert Montesquieu, not to confuse with Montesquieu, the philosopher of the the philosopher of the Enlightenment. Sorry. So it is necessary, he says, in order to form a clear idea of the true state of art, and not to think, as many do, that decadence is an accidental, temporary phenomenon. But yeah, so he goes hard on Baudelaire and Verlaine after quoting two poems of Baudelaire and pointing out that there are degrees of obscurity in his poetry, both in verse and in prose. He still insists that all his works demand a certain effort to be understood, and the efforts aren't even worth it. There is not one poem that is simple and can be understood without some effort, an effort seldom rewarded, because the feelings conveyed by the poet are not good ones and are quite base. And these feelings are always expressed with deliberate originality and absurdity. So this intentional obscurity is particularly noticeable in prose, where the author could speak simply if he wished to. And then he goes through three other poems by Baudelaire from his prose poems and commented on them like this. However artificial this work is, with some effort one can guess what the author wished to say, but there are pieces that are entirely incomprehensible, to me at least. Like those are the three options with Baudelaire. Either you understand, but after some efforts, which aren't even worth it due to the quality of the feeling, and it was completely, unnecessary to be this obscure, to say something that you could have said clearly, or you understand some bits, still with efforts, but fail to grasp other parts, or you completely fail to understand or grasp anything. And then he moves on to Verlaine, whose works are no less fanciful and no less incomprehensible. So Verlaine uses metaphors and comparisons not to make his claim clearer, but rather to puzzle even more, like he wants to be misunderstood. And so with Verlaine, you have two options. Either it is completely incomprehensible, or it is intelligible, but is just terribly written. So he says, all this is not only incomprehensible, but under the pretext of conveying a mood, is a series of false comparisons and words. Besides these artificial and obscure poems, there are others which are intelligible but quite bad, both in form and content. So like I said, now we are just interested in Tolstoy's point, so we're not going to bother with reading the versifiers, Baudelaire and Verlaine. A versifier is another word for poet. We'll just take his word for it, that they are bad poets and are obscure on purpose. And so Tolstoy can only wonder, because by that time, Baudelaire and Verlaine were celebrities. They were respected, recognized, and acclaimed as perhaps the best French poets of the 19th century. And so Tolstoy asks, how could the French, who had Chénier, Musset, Lamartine, and above all, Victor Hugo, who still recently had the so-called Parnassians, Le Comte de Lille, Sully Prudhomme, and all, ascribe such significance to these two versifiers and consider them great when they are so unskillful in form and quite base and banal in content? Now, what is meant by unskillful in form and banal in content? Well, unskillful in form means that when you write a poem, the poem that you give, that you give it form, the form that you give to your poem, like the rhyme scheme, the meter, the literary devices, etc., aren't here to facilitate the process of infecting others with feelings, but of pleasing them. It's about making the poem beautiful and thereby artificial. Base and banal in content now is what the poem is about. It's both what the poem itself is talking about and the feeling that you try to convey, if there are any feelings. So poems and any form of art, according to Tolstoy, are manifestation of a religious consciousness, of a striving towards an ideal. They are then inherently normative. So they indicate what should be considered good and what should be considered bad, and that's the content, and of course both content and form depend on one another. A poem that aims at beauty, so its form, will have a specific content. Good poetry with a good content cannot have the kind of form that these poets utilize. Like, you can know from the form of the poem what it's going to be about, and from the content, you know what the poem is going or supposed to look like. And this again echoes with the previous consequence of impoverishment, because art becomes predictable and therefore sterile. It no longer brings in new feelings, but simply repeats conventions. In the case of Baudelaire, he fails at both form and content because, being an upper-class poet, he has a worldview that already determines how bad his poems are going to be. He, Baudelaire, had a word outlook that consisted of crude egoism erected into a theory and the supplanting of morality by the concept of beauty, indefinite as the clouds and invariably artificial. Baudelaire preferred woman's face painted rather than natural, and metal trees and a mineral simulacrum of water to the real things. And so indeed, upper-class poetry is directed inward. It's about the poet's own inner world that he doesn't even want to share. Hence, despite writing poems for an audience, he makes it incomprehensible. That's the egoism that pervades the upper classes. We can guess that these people struggle to make connections and bonds with others. It's like their circle encourages them to be isolated and misunderstood. Failing to make a connection is seen as a success. And so this is the sign of unbelief, according to Tolstoy. And the same holds for Verlaine. These poets, trying so hard to be mysterious, obscure, and deep, end up revealing more about themselves than about anything else, which, again, can be their aim, right? Their egoism is contradictory. On the one hand, they don't want to be understood, as if, they don't want to be seen for who they are. They don't want to give away their most innate feelings, yet at the same time, all that shows in their poetry is them. The poem is about them. They want people to speak about them and marvel at how mysterious and unconventional they are, when in fact they are as conventional as they come. So Verlaine too has, according to Tolstoy, a world outlook which consists of flabby licentiousness, the confession of his own moral impotence, and as salvation from this impotence, the crudest Catholic idolatry. So he continues, for all that they are both, Verlaine and Baudelaire, not only totally devoid of naivety, sincerity, and simplicity, but are filled with artificiality, forced originality, and self-conceit. So that in the least bad of their works, one sees more of Messieurs Baudelaire and Verlaine than of what they are portraying. And these two bad versifiers form a school and lead hundreds of followers after them. So given how bad these poets are, it is still a mystery of how they got to be celebrated as geniuses of French poetry. And Tolstoy makes an attempt to explain this, and the explanation is, again, boredom and the need to distract oneself with amusement. The poetry of Baudelaire and Verlaine is another attempt, perhaps the most advanced attempt at wearing off boredom. All these forms of poetry are indeed different from one another. Baudelaire and Verlaine are different from one another, and also from the ones that came before them, but they are not different in terms of content. It's just that the form of the previous poets no longer amuses, and so a new form is necessary. If those of the past sought other means besides obscurity to amuse their readers, their content is still no different from Baudelaire and Verlaine's. They still convey the same base three feelings, pride, lust, and boredom, that we mentioned. So Tolstoy says this: there is one explanation of this phenomenon, that art for the society in which these two versifiers are active is not a serious, important matter of life, but is merely an amusement. And any amusement becomes boring with repetition. In order to make the boring amusement possible again, it must be renewed in some way. When Boston gets boring, whist is invented. When whist gets boring, preference is invented. When preference gets boring, some other new thing is invented, and so on. So these are card games popular among the upper classes, the poker and blackjack of the time. The essence of the matter remains the same. Only the forms change. So it is with this art, its content, becoming more and more limited, finally reaches the point where artists of the exclusive classes think that everything has already been said and it is no longer possible to say anything new. And so to renew this art, they seek new forms. Baudelaire and Verlaine, while inventing a new form, have also enhanced it with previously unused pornographic details, and the critics and public recognize them as great writers. This alone explains the success not only of Baudelaire and Verlaine, but of the entire decadent movement. So then he moves to Mallarmé and Maeterlinck, whose poems have no meaning for the same reasons. So these are like the poets mentioned earlier in the appendix. All of their poems are equally incomprehensible or comprehensible only with great effort and then not fully. And yet they are reprinted and re-edited, and their poems are sold by the tens of thousands everywhere in Europe and Russia. Whether in Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, or Russia, if not millions, at least hundreds of thousands of copies are typeset and printed. Some sell in tens of thousands, which, again, requires extreme and enormous labor. He says, to typeset, print, compose, and bind these books, millions and millions of working days are spent, no less, I think, than for the building of a big pyramid. But not only that, the same thing goes on in all the other arts, and millions of working days are spent to produce objects just as incomprehensible in painting, music, drama. So don't forget the central thesis in this book, that enormous amount of labor are wasted on art while countless are starving. Remember that was Tolstoy's motivation to write this book. So many people are suffering, but the labor required to relieve their suffering is wasted on art. So, we work, killing ourselves to the bone, to manufacture the resources needed for these artists to make their art, which is destined to the upper classes who cannot get enough of their writings. And even if you say, hold on a minute, how can these poets sell this much if their poetry is destined to their small circles? Well, that's because the small circle is small compared to the majority of people, but if you count how many people are in those circles, you are easily looking at hundreds of thousands, and of course, these buy multiple copies. Each time a new edition pops up, they must have it. And like we said, this isn't confined to just poetry, but the same is true for the other forms of art. Tolstoy mentions painting and a testimony from the diary of an amateur of painting who visited the Paris exhibition in 1894, who is actually his daughter, Tatiana Tolstoy. So she and her father, they had a very close and intimate relationship. You remember from the introduction when Tolstoy moved to Moscow, the whole Moscow census episode, I said that the reason he and his family moved was for their children's education. But precisely, they moved in autumn 1881, and they moved for Tatiana, so that she enrolls in the Academy of Painting, Sculpture, and Architecture. And Tolstoy was very reluctant. Already back then, he had a strong disdain and defiance towards the world of art. And he was actually afraid that he would lose Tatiana, the daughter who was closest to him, to the world of art education. So he did everything in his power to limit the Art Academy's influence on Tatiana, sometimes called Tanya. He always kept an eye on her progress, and according to Jones in the introduction of the Bloomsbury edition, he was a frequent visitor to her college, and he'd have hot debates with her professors on the nature of art. But you can say that everything went well, since we know that she was dutifully copying drafts after drafts of what is art. So as Jones put it, Tolstoy's fear that she might be in danger of being seduced away from him by false world of modern art didn't come true. And she was now at his side as his, helpmate in copying out his drafts. But most importantly, during her stay in Paris in 1894, she went to the Impressionist exhibition and made her own negative and decidedly Tolstoyan response to the paintings exhibited there. And apparently it made Tolstoy so proud and happy that he included her reaction in the chapter, although I don't know why he recasts the passage into a masculine gender. But anyways, every scholar agrees that the amateur here is his daughter. So it's a bit long response, but she basically says the same thing Tolstoy said concerning Verlaine and Baudelaire. And also she says the same thing about the Impressionists. And we can guess that she'd say the same thing with the post-impressionist movements like Expressionism, Futurism, Cubism, etc. So she says, "Today I attended 3 exhibitions: Symbolists, Impressionists, and Neo-Impressionists. I looked at the painting conscientiously and diligently, but again the same perplexity and in the end indignation. The first exhibition of Camille Pissarro is still the most comprehensible, though there is no drawing, no content, and the colors are most incredible. The drawing is so indefinite that one sometimes cannot tell which way a hand or head is turned. The content is mostly effet de brouillard, effet du soir, effet couchant, soleil couchant. So several paintings with figures but without subject. So effet means effect, so effect of fog, of evening and sunset. Impressionists love to draw the effects of something instead of the thing because they judge that with photography, painting has to find another subject than representing things as they are. So she continues, in coloring there is a predominance of bright blue and bright green, and each painting has its basic tone, with which the painting is as if spattered. For example, the Goose Girl has a basic tone of vert de gris, and there are spots of this color everywhere, on her face, her arms, dress, in the same Durand-Ruel gallery. Other paintings by Chavannes, Manet, Monet, Renoir, Sisley. These are all Impressionists. One of them, I could not make out his name, something like Redon, painted a blue face in profile. The whole face is just this blue tone with some white. In Pissarro, there is one watercolor done entirely in dots. In the foreground, a cow, all painted in multicolored dots. One cannot catch the general tone, whether one stands back or steps close. From there, I went to look at the symbolists. I looked for a long time without asking anyone, trying to guess for myself what the point was, but it was beyond human comprehension. One of the first things that struck my eye was a wooden wooden haut-relief of ugly execution portraying a woman naked who with her two hands is squeezing streams of blood from her nipples. The blood flows down and becomes purple flowers. The hair first hangs down, then is pulled up, turning into trees. The figure is painted yellow all over, the hair is brown. Then a painting, a yellow sea, and floating in it what might be a ship or might be a heart. On the horizon, a profile with a halo and yellow hair that becomes the sea and gets lost in it. The paint in some paintings is applied so thickly that it comes out as something between painting and sculpture. A third work, still less comprehensible, a male profile before it a flame and black stripes. Leeches, it was later explained to me. I finally asked a gentleman who was there what it all means, and he explained to me that the statue was a symbol, that it represented la terre, the earth, that the heart floating in the yellow sea was illusion, and the gentleman with the leeches was le mal, evil. There were several Impressionist paintings among them. Primitive profiles with some flower in their hands, monochrome, no drawing, and either completely indefinite or else outlined with a broad black contour. So that's for painting. It's just, as incomprehensible as poetry. And Tolstoy mentions a few followers as well before moving on to drama. He mentions the Swiss painter and father of German symbolism, Arnold Böcklin, who also had a strong influence on the surrealists, particularly Giorgio de Chirico, as well as painters and sculptors like Franz Stock, Max Klinger, and Schneider. All of them are Böcklin's followers. Now moving on to drama. So again, it's the same thing. No one knows what the hell they are watching. He gives summaries of few plots, but he doesn't give the plays, but Pevear lists them in the footnotes there. So Tolstoy goes on. We are shown an architect who for some reason has not fulfilled his early lofty intentions and consequently climbs on the roof of a house he has built and throws himself off it head first. So that's from The Master Builder by the Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen. Or some incomprehensible old woman who exterminates rats and who for no apparent reason takes a poetical child to the sea and drowns him there. So that's from Little Eyolf, also by Ibsen. Or some blind men who sit on the seashore and for some reason keep repeating the same thing over and over again. So that's from Maeterlinck's play Les Aveugles, The Blind Men. Or some bell that falls into a lake and rings there. So that's from The Drowned Bell by a German playwright Hauptmann. Hauptmann. So you can guess that Tolstoy would have also, hated Samuel Beckett if he had lived long enough to know him. Then he continues with music, an art which it seems ought to be understood in the same way by everyone. So what does he have to say here? So this is about music. A well-known musician of your acquaintance sits down to the piano and plays for you what he says is a new work of his or of one of the new composers. You listen to the strange, loud noises, marvel at the gymnastic exercises of the fingers, and see clearly that the composer wishes to suggest to you that the sounds he is producing are poetic yearnings of the soul. You see his intention, but no other feeling is communicated to you except boredom. The performance goes on for a long time, or so at least it seems to you, a very long time, because without perceiving anything clearly, you involuntarily recall the words of Alphonse Karr, plus ça va vite, plus ça dure longtemps. So the quicker it goes, the longer it lasts. And it occurs to you that it is perhaps a mystification, that the performer is testing you, throwing his hands and fingers randomly on the keys, hoping you will get caught in the trap and start praising him, at which point he will laugh and confess that he was merely testing you. But when it is finally over and the musician rises, sweaty and excited, from the piano, obviously expecting to be praised, you see that it was all very serious. So now, who do you think he's targeting here? Obviously, he's not talking of John Cage, but Samuel, the Samuel Beckett of music, but of composers of his time: Liszt, Wagner, Berlioz, Brahms, and the latest, Richard Strauss, and countless others who ceaselessly compose opera after opera, symphony after symphony, piece after piece. Yep, classical music. He could have thrown also in Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart there too, and actually he does. There are many passages where he attacks Beethoven, especially his late period, although he likes, some Chopin. And as for the others, he doesn't necessarily dislike them, contrary to Wagner. He has such a hate boner towards Wagner, but he'll say that first, there are only a few things that can be taken seriously in them, and that even at their best, they are not worth, they're not worth popular art. But we'll get to that. For now, his point is that art is becoming more and more incomprehensible, that contemporary artists, in their constant quest to find new forms to amuse their public, have just, turned art into absurdities that no one can understand or even enjoy, that even beauty is no longer itself the source of pleasure. Like instead of discarding beauty for prioritizing feelings, the evolution of art has gone so far in its desperate attempt to please the upper classes with its pseudo-originality that even beauty doesn't do anymore. And now pleasure. And now pleasure comes from just stimulating the senses. When people are numb, pleasure simply becomes whatever stimulates them. Even pain and suffering becomes pleasure at this point. Listening to Wagner is torture for Tolstoy, but people enjoy it because at least they can experience something. And Tolstoy is already impressed that we managed to even make music incomprehensible. But we also managed to do the same with the novel and the short story, with storytelling. Like, forget poetry. If there is an art form that should be as far removed as possible from incomprehensiveness, it is storytelling. It's the novel. And yet, even that, we managed to ruin. You read Là-bas by Huysmans, or short stories by Kipling, or L'Annonciateur from Les Contes Cruels of Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, etc. And all this is for you not only abscons, a new word of the new writers, which means difficult to understand, but utterly incomprehensible both in form and in content. Such, for instance, is the novel Terre Promise by Eugène Morel, as well as the majority of new novels. The style is quite bold, the feelings seem to be lofty, but one simply cannot understand what is happening, where, and to whom. So now you may say that Tolstoy just being grumpy, just like, any previous generation was grumpy towards the generations that comes, generation that comes after it. It's a known fact that all the generations tend to devalue the art of the younger generation. But if Tolstoy is concerned It's not because of generational gap, but first, these new trends aren't that different from the trends of the old generation, scorning them, but their continuation. Like both generations, old and young, are from the upper classes and share the same religious consciousness or lack thereof, and use the same principles in art, namely that art ought to please. So, if Tolstoy seems harsher towards the young artist and urges the people of the first generation of the century, of the first half of the 19th century, so the previous generation, the admirers of Goethe, Schiller, Musset, Hugo, Dickens, Beethoven, Chopin, Raphael, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Delacroix, understanding nothing of this new art and often simply regard its works as tasteless madness and wish to ignore them, he urges them not to underestimate this progression. Ignoring the new art as if this is just a phase will quickly fade away due to the tastelessness of and madness of the artist is naive for Tolstoy, and completely unfounded because these trends are spreading more and more and have already won itself a firm position in society precisely because they are the logical continuation of the older generation's taste. The early 19th century, artists and critics are, romantics who themselves were viewed as just a passing phase by their elders. And yet Romanticism also got a firm position in society. They themselves produced works with tasteless madness. So this isn't just a phase that will go away by ignoring it, because actually no one is ignoring it. And as I said, this Tolstoy brings as the second point: if the older generation dismisses the new artists because they are incomprehensible to them, well, shouldn't we also scream at their hypocrisy, since what they consider beautiful was already incomprehensible to the masses? Like, this is why I say that this is not a break continuation, but it's not a break, but a continuation. The underlying principle here is whether the agreed upon beautiful art is upper class art or popular art. Clearly it's upper class, which was already incomprehensible to the masses. Art since the Renaissance has been a movement that progressively cuts itself from the masses with each generation, and therefore becomes more incomprehensible as times go by. So that's Tolstoy's response. If we are able to judge the works of the latest so-called decadent art in this way, simply because we do not understand them, then there is an enormous number of people, including all working people and many non-workers, who in exactly the same way do not understand those works of art which we consider beautiful. The poems of our own favorite artists, Goethe, Schiller, Hugo, and the novels of Dickens, the music of Beethoven and Chopin, the paintings of Raphael, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, etc. So in other words, if the previous upper class generation argues that its favorite beautiful art is incomprehensible to the masses, and it's because it is incomprehensible to the masses that it becomes a sign of prestige to us, then it cannot pull the move of, oh, your art is incomprehensible to us, then it is not art, to the next upper class generation. So he says, if I have the right to think that large masses of people neither understand nor love what I recognize as unquestionably good because they are not sufficiently developed, then I have no right to deny that it is possible for me not to understand or love the new works of art because I am insufficiently developed to understand them. And if I have the right to say that, I, along with the majority of like-minded people, do not understand the works of the new art simply because there is nothing to understand and because it is bad art, then a still greater majority, the entire mass of working people who do not understand what I regard as beautiful art, have the same right to say that what I regard as good is bad. Like what I regard as good art is bad art, and there is nothing in it to understand. So indeed, when a Victor Hugo doesn't understand Baudelaire, the logical conclusion for Hugo is to wonder, maybe he's dumb. He's too dumb to understand Baudelaire. Like he assumes that just like he assumes that the masses are too dumb to understand his poetry. But if Hugo says that no, he can, make that judgment, then he has to contend that given that the masses don't understand his poetry, then it means that his poetry is indeed trash. And so these are the two sides of the dilemma. But that's precisely what all generations of the upper classes have been doing. Tolstoy gives the following anecdote, that one day he saw a poet who writes incomprehensible verses laugh with merry self-confidence at the incomprehensible music of a musician who soon afterwards laughed with the same self-confidence at incomprehensible poetry. Like, why are you laughing? You are both incomprehensible. And so it's impossible for the old generation, and even Tolstoy says that about himself, that even I cannot condemn the new art and have no right to condemn it simply because, as a man brought up in the first half of the century, I do not understand it. I can only say that I am unable to understand it. Indeed, he cannot make that move unless he also regards the kind of art of his generation, the older generation, as also incomprehensible. And that's precisely what he does, and he disavows his entire class. The only advantage that his generation's art has over the art of the decadent is that the art which I recognize is understood by a slightly larger number of people than present-day art. But for those who should, be the rightful jury of the quality of art on the masses, it's all gibberish. So all art of the upper classes is incomprehensible to the masses, that, among those classes there's an even lesser number of people understanding the new art doesn't mean shit. The art of the older generation is still trash, and they still have no justification for it other than being accustomed or habituated to regarding it as beautiful. But as Tolstoy says, from the fact that I am accustomed to a certain exclusive art and understand it, while I do not understand a still more exclusive art, I have no right to conclude that this art, my art, is the most true art, and that the art I do not understand is not true art and is bad. I can only conclude from it that art, as it has become more and more exclusive, has become more and more incomprehensible for a larger and larger number of people. And in this movement towards greater and greater incomprehensibility, one step of which I occupy with my accustomed art, it has reached a point where it is understood by a very small number of the elect, and that this number of the elect keeps getting smaller and smaller. So it seems like the only thing bothering the older generation at the sight of new art is the fear of getting replaced or becoming irrelevant. It's kind of like those washed up old artists who go around saying that all new art is trash because they're still trying to remain in the spotlight, but their music was already trash back then. It's just that the new artist is trashier. But all is coming from the same bin. And so, as Tolstoy said, the art loved and understood by his generation was just a step in the process of incomprehensiveness which started with the Renaissance. So the moment the art of the upper classes becomes separate from the art of the whole people. So at that moment, the delusion started, which is the belief or conviction that somehow art can still be art and yet be incomprehensible to the masses. Like, this is the heights of absurdity for Tolstoy. To believe that what makes art is, first, its incomprehensiveness, that it is incomprehensible to the masses, and two, art may be comprehensible only to a small number of the elect, and finally, only for two or one, at best, a best friend, one's own self. So, if what you do is comprehensible to you only, then it is art. So this is what modern artists say straight on. I create and I understand myself. If others do not understand me, so much the worse for them. And soon enough, we'll have a theory that denies even that and goes further. If it is incomprehensible to even myself, then I am an artist. And there are already, theories that point to that direction, giving the number of theories of art that, take madmen, like actual crazy people, as true artists. So it's completely insane to suggest that the value of art is that it's incomprehensible by the masses. And we've seen its consequences anyways, that it's just an ideological tool to justify social hierarchies. The masses work and we enjoy. So he says, the assertion that art can be good art and yet be incomprehensible to a large number of people is so wrong. Its consequences are so pernicious for art, and it is at the same time so widespread, so embedded in our notions that no explanation of its utter incongruity can suffice. So whenever you hear someone say of a book, a play, or a piece of music, a painting, sculpture, or whatever, that it is very good but very difficult to understand, and they even suggest that there is a causal relation between these two characteristics, it's okay to go to prison over them. That's a joke. Don't do it. Don't do that. But yeah, it's a common assertion nowadays that works of art are supposed to be difficult to understand in order to be good. So this even became like a motto of all art and literature teachers and professors. But this is for Tolstoy complete rubbish. This is like saying that some kind of food is very good, but people cannot eat it, or this food is good if most people, find it disgusting. And sure, you find people like that, usually upper class people too, who have weird food taste. The weird gastronomies with perverted taste, as Tolstoy calls them, who appreciate dishes like rotten cheese or putrid goose. But we all know, that nutritious food, like good food, like bread and fruit, are only good when people like them. So just like with food, that, most food is good precisely because it is judged good by the masses, and weird dishes are only good for the perverted gentleman, perverted art also may be incomprehensible to people, but good art is always understood by everyone. So that's how we should know the difference between good and bad art. If it is appreciated by a small minority, especially the upper classes, then it's bad. If it is appreciated by everyone, it's good. Sure, there are things, and not a few, in which the reverse is true, where the judgment of a minority ought to be more reliable than the judgment of the masses. And if you are a fan of Socrates, you would argue that the food analogy doesn't work here, but in the case of art, as Tolstoy presents it, you may say that he has a point. Art is perhaps the only subject that the majority of people should serve as absolute authority here. But let's suppose that, alright, art should be difficult. Let's pretend to agree that the best works of art are such that they cannot be understood by the majority and are accessible only to the elect, who are prepared to understand these great works. Now, obviously, it is difficult to understand something. If it is difficult to understand something, it means that someone has to receive some sort of training to be able to understand that thing, right? Unless you want to suppose that there is something innate that confers to whomever possesses it some ability to understand and produce art, yet somehow science cannot explain this ability or its source. But then you are venturing into complete mysticism and into superpowers domain. And now you have to come up with scenarios of the everlasting battle, between talent and effort. Some people are born with talent and can understand and produce art easily, but only a few are born with such capacity without being able to explain why that is. Or you will say that even for those born with talent, it is still difficult, so they also need to make efforts, although they need to make less effort than someone born with no talent, and therefore we are completely lost in speculation. But whatever scenario you pick, the truth remains that if it is difficult, not impossible, then effort is necessary, and so training is required. But then that presupposes that in case someone doesn't understand art, we can give an explanation to why is that. Before training, I need to know how to train and what to train specifically. Training to be physically strong needs knowledge of how muscles work. So the same applies here. If I want to understand art, I need the knowledge necessary for understanding what is required from me to understand art. In other words, if the majority do not understand, they must be given an explanation, the knowledge necessary for understanding. Like, here's why you fail to understand, and here's what you have to do in order to succeed at understanding. So we are expecting some knowledge. It would be very suspicious if that knowledge doesn't exist, right? To tell why I fail to understand a painting, there has to be a knowledge of why I failed, which also implies a knowledge of the painting. To explain to me what to do in order to understand a painting, you need to be able to also explain the painting. Well, that's precisely it. That knowledge is nowhere to be found. The only answer the upper classes can give is just keep exposing yourself to the art over and over again, and at one point, I don't know, something will click and boom, you understand. So to quote Tolstoy, but it turns out that this knowledge does not exist, that the works cannot be explained, and therefore those who say that the majority do not understand good works of art give no explanations, but say that in order to understand, one must read, look at, or listen to the same work over and over again. But this is not to explain, it is to make accustomed. And one can get accustomed to anything, even the worst, as it is possible to get people accustomed to rotten food, vodka, tobacco, opium, so it is possible to get them accustomed to bad art, which in fact is being done. So that's their explanation. Just get used to it, and you will eventually like it. But the question remains, why do I have to? You can't just tell me that I have to get accustomed to something if you are incapable of explaining it. Because that means that you have no idea if it's a good or a bad thing. Is it something that will benefit me, and more importantly, benefit everyone, the majority, or harm the majority? If all you have is just conditioning to get someone to understand something, that's, a sign that the thing is probably bad and harmful, and that the person isn't understanding shit. Since with enough time you can get, someone used to absolutely anything, getting accustomed to something doesn't justify the thing. Plus, where does this assertion that the majority of people lack the taste to appreciate the highest works of art come from? It's empirically false. You can simply see that the majority understand the highest works of art by examining the content of what's considered the highest art by the upper classes. Yet it contains, it contains paintings, plays, classical music, novels, poems, etc. So it contains everything we've discussed so far, works produced by individual geniuses, right? But it also contains the artistically simple narratives of the Bible, the gospel parables, folk legends, fairy tales, folk songs, which are understood by everyone. And guess what? These have been around longer than the works of individual geniuses. And even those of individual geniuses used to be perfectly understood by everyone, by the masses. Homer's epics, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, all their tragedies were performed for the masses. You can even argue that it was still the case even in Shakespeare's time, and his plays were performed for everyone, now the king, queen, and nobles, as well as the lower classes. So this claim that the majority cannot understand the highest works of art is a recent invention. And if it were true, then those who defend the elitist views of art will find a hard time trying to explain why is it that the majority suddenly lost the ability to understand the highest of our art. I mean, the European masses will struggle with Homer and the tragedians and all playwrights of antiquity, since they are spoken in Greek and Latin, as it would, be for common man with Shakespeare, since their English has evolved and looks very different from the English in which Shakespeare's plays were written in. But it would be quite the fallacy to use that to support the claim that the majority cannot understand art, just like you cannot blame someone for finding a beautiful speech incomprehensible and therefore fail to see its beauty when that person doesn't understand the language of the speech. By the same token, the Chinese should look at European society as incapable of understanding art because they don't understand Chinese. So as Tolstoy says, speech uttered in Chinese may be beautiful and yet remain incomprehensible to me if I do not know Chinese. But that's just at the level of speech. Sure, if someone doesn't speak Greek, reading the Iliad or the Odyssey would move him in the least, since it is incomprehensible. However, it is different when there are other elements besides speech. Art can circumvent the limit of speech, because even though I don't understand what characters are saying on stage, for example, I can still be infected with feelings through their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their eloquence in speaking, their gestures, etc. So that's why, despite being incapable of understanding a Chinese speech, Tolstoy adds, but a work of art is distinguished from all other spiritual activity in that its language is understandable to everyone, that it infects everyone without distinction. So the masses watching Oedipus Rex will be moved even if they don't understand Greek. But the upper classes, they don't care about that. Looking to establish their dominance over the masses, they'll place the importance of understanding art on precisely what they know the masses lack, meaning speech in this case. Of course, understanding the words plays a huge role in enjoying the play, but you actually don't need that to understand the play as a work of art. The only thing that is required is if you get infected with the feeling. Of course, the artist needs to intend for you to get infected to call, the work of art a work of art. But we're not going to get too demanding with the artist. If you get affected by a feeling that he didn't intend, but intended another feeling, that's fine. But usually everyone will be affected in the same way by the things that moved beyond the barriers of language. It will just be a difference of degree. Tolstoy gives a few examples. The tears, the laughter of a Chinese will infect me in just the same way as the tears and laughter of a Russian, as will painting and music or a work of poetry if it is translated into a language I understand. The song of a Kyrgyz, not sure of the pronunciation, or a Japanese moves me, though not as much as it moves the Kyrgyz or the Japanese themselves. So too, I am moved by Japanese paintings and Indian architecture and Arabian tales. See, Tolstoy doesn't believe that language is that much of a barrier when you take art for what it really is, a means to communicate feelings. And the thing about feelings is that they are the same for everyone. There's no such thing as a feeling exclusive to some people or some cultures. What can be exclusive is which feelings are considered good or bad. But all humans experience the same feelings. There is no such thing as a feeling that can only be communicated in Arabic or Chinese or Greek, French, Sanskrit or Latin. And so even poems can be translated without losing their particularity. The point of the translation is to make sure that the feeling is conserved, not the meaning or the play on word or the culture's identity or whatever. So in art there is always something that can be felt by everyone. There is always a feeling accessible to all, even if the speech, if there is a speech involved in that art, is incomprehensible to the audience. The incomprehensiveness of the young decadent poets is an incomprehensiveness that seeks to obstruct even the feelings because it traps you at the level of speech. They want to feel to feel something, those three base feelings, not by going beyond the incomprehensible words and phrases, but by the fact that the words and phrases are incomprehensible. And so it is no different from the older generations who want you to have access to feelings when they aren't concerned with beauty by understanding the speech itself. They want you to be moved by Homer's and Sophocles' words rather than the actual anger of Achilles or the despair of Oedipus. So the takeaway here is, on the one hand, in works of art that don't involve speech, the whole art must be comprehensible, meaning the whole art should infect us with feelings. And therefore, in cases where this doesn't happen, as with symbolist paintings or Wagnerian music or modern architecture and sculpture, the fault lies in the intention of the artist, who deliberately made his art in such a way to be incomprehensible by everyone. And on the other hand, the works of art that involve speech, there are those that combine it with other elements such as performance, as in drama or singing, and there are those that rely entirely on speech, like novels. In the former case, I can still understand the art through those other elements that move me: crying, smiles, tones in voice, rhythm, etc. And in the latter, not understanding the novel, if written in a foreign language, one that I don't, understand, I will fail to be moved, but not because the work isn't a work of art, but simply because I don't understand the language. If, however, I do understand the language and still fail to be moved, then it's because it was designed to be incomprehensible, and therefore it's not art. But this is speaking from a point of view that Tolstoy shares with the masses, of course, because there's also the possibility of failing to be moved by actual works of art, whether we speak the language or not. And that is if we are accustomed to the higher works of art. If our taste is perverted by the upper classes, we will fail to be moved by what moves the masses. And take that as a sign that it's the masses who don't understand true art. But Tolstoy is aware of this bias, and so he says, if I am little moved by a Japanese song or a Chinese novel, it is not because I do not understand these works, but because I know and am accustomed to higher works of art, and by no means because this art is above me. So there is then his most important takeaway. Great works of art are great only because they are accessible and comprehensible to everyone. So when it comes to stories, which relies exclusively on speech, once translated, if it is a true work of art, no one can fail to be moved by it. So Tolstoy says that the great stories that shaped civilizations and cultures are works of art because anyone can be moved by them. The story of Joseph, translated into Chinese, moves the Chinese. The story of Sakyamuni, which is another name for the Buddha, moves us. The same is true of buildings, paintings, statues, music. And hence Tolstoy does something important here. The upper classes have been gaslighting us that if we don't get moved by their art, then something is wrong with us. And this has been one of their strategies to maintain their hegemony. We cannot question the art that they produce, we can only question our understanding. However, Tolstoy flips it up. So he flips it up and dares us to question the art itself. If it doesn't move the majority, then after translation, if it involves speech, well then, maybe it's because your art is shite, and thereby giving power back to where it belongs, to the people. And therefore, he says, if art does not move us, one must not say that the cause is the spectators or listeners' incomprehension, but one can and must conclude that it is either bad art or not art at all. And also an important thing to point in Tolstoy is that art is not a mental activity in the sense that no one has to be an initiate to be moved by it. No effort is required, no knowledge, no preparation. That's what a mental activity needs. A mental activity, he says, requires preparation and a certain sequence of learning so that one cannot teach trigonometry to someone who doesn't know geometry. But art is different, and it is precisely for that it is democratic in its nature. By not being a mental activity, no one can claim expertise on it. The only expert is the majority. Art affects people independently of their degree of development and education. Now, the difference with a mental activity is that the charm of a picture, of sound, of images infects any man, or whatever level of development, on whatever level of development they may stand. So no one needs to think or know specific things to be moved by art, but its importance, the importance of art, doesn't lie in just that fact. If we stop at that fact, then we will have to say that either art or reasoning is useless. If what art conveys can be conveyed by reason, then we have two means to convey the same thing, and so one of them becomes useless. And if art does it with less efforts than reason, then perhaps reason is useless. But that's not how it is. Remember that we have two spheres of communication. People communicate through sharing ideas, but also feelings. And the first is a mental activity. And this requires reasoning, while the second requires artistic expression. So neither can do the other's job, but we need both. Reason can never convey feelings, and that's why it is difficult to find the right words to express ourselves, because what we try to express in those moments aren't ideas. Of course, you can struggle to convey ideas if you like certain words, but we can invent words for that. With feelings, no matter how large your vocabulary and how smart and learned you are, you cannot express them that way. You need art. So he says the business of art consists precisely in making understandable and accessible that which might be incomprehensible and inaccessible in the form of reasoning. Usually when a person receives a truly artistic impression, it seems to him that he knew it all along, only he was unable to express it. So he isn't saying that feelings are incomprehensible or inaccessible full stop. you would be, that would be decadent art. No, he says that they are, if you try to express them through reason. And while it is true that reasoning, mental activity, requires preparation, proper training, expertise, etc., art doesn't. And so technically, nothing is more comprehensible and accessible than feelings, and therefore art. So what's the real criterion for the highest arts? Well, it is its ability to infect everyone, as many people as possible, with feelings by being comprehensible and accessible. If we consider the Iliad, the Odyssey, the stories of Jacob, Isaac, Joseph, the Hebrew prophets, the Psalms, the Gospel parables, and the story of Sakyamuni, and the Vedic hymns, the foundational text of Hinduism as highest forms of art, it's because they all convey very lofty feelings, and in spite of that are fully understandable to show us, to the educated and the uneducated, and were understood by people of their own times who were still less educated than our own working people. So the working classes are unable to understand art. That's just bullshit and a recent invention. If they are incapable of understanding art, it simply means that the art is bad. So all that talk of incomprehensibility that the upper classes insist upon to exclude the masses from art, don't buy into it. Art, as Tolstoy says, arises from religious consciousness, from striving towards the good, which Tolstoy also defines as a relation to God. If that's indeed the source of art, then how can it be incomprehensible? He says, if art is the conveying of feelings that arise from people's religious consciousness, how can a feeling based on religion, that is, on man's relation to God, be incomprehensible? Such art must be, and indeed has always been, understandable to everyone because each man's relation to God is always the same, and therefore temples and the images and singing in them have always been understandable to everyone. The obstacle to understanding the best and highest feelings, as is also said in the Gospel, by no means lies in an absence of development and education, but on the contrary, in false development and false education. A good and lofty artistic work may indeed be incomprehensible, only not to simple, unperverted working people. They understand all that is lofty. No, but a true artistic work may be and often is incomprehensible to highly educated, perverted, religion-deprived people, as constantly occurs in our society, where people find the highest religious feelings simply incomprehensible. So yeah, for Tolstoy, art is a religious experience, perhaps the religious experience. All religions are artistic in their nature, since they all seek to unite all men through shared feelings. Sure, you can argue that some religions are more egalitarian than others, that some explicitly endorse slavery, human and child sacrifice, or justify caste systems, but their aim is still forming communities of men. It's just that some unite more than others. But still, the fact that religions work means that what they teach is easily comprehensible when they are not perverted, at least to their adherents. And given that they are centered around feelings, religions are works of art themselves. The point is, the uneducated masses never had to wrestle with the meaning of those texts or the feelings conveyed in them. It's actually the upper classes who struggle with these. They are the ones incapable of understanding the highest art. As Opie says, these refined men, as Tolstoy says, I said Opie. As Tolstoy says, these refined men, they do not understand the poetry of love for one's neighbor and of self-denial, or the poetry of chastity. And yes, I agree that bits of this book didn't age well, and I cannot agree with many things, given I'm a naturalist, so that's why I was thinking of OP. But remember that I don't necessarily endorse the views presented in the books that I read on my channel, but try to present them as faithfully as I can. But obviously I'm deeply sympathetic to Tolstoy's argument, since he tries to give power to the masses by subverting the social hierarchy and bringing it back to its natural order. So the upper classes are the ones who are stupid to the point where they cannot understand what is intuitively true to even children, and their reign of perversion is only recent. For all of human history, things were done in the opposite way. Good, great universal religious art may be incomprehensible only for a small circle of perverted people, but not otherwise. So as we said, the masses should be and are the true judges of art. And art is determined, good or bad, from the reaction it provokes from the masses. So if the masses understand it and are infected by it, it is good. If they aren't, it is bad. So the assertion, art can be incomprehensible to the great masses only because it is very good, as artists of our time like to say, that is wrong. And the right answer is, the great masses do not understand art only because this art is very bad or even is not art at all. And moreover, that the most beloved argument naively accepted by the cultivated mob, according to which in order to feel art one must understand it, which in fact merely means get accustomed to it, is the surest thing, is the surest sign that what is offered to our understanding in this way is either very bad art, exclusive art, or not art at all. And then he continues to expose, the upside down worldview of the upper classes, but it's the same point over and over again. He says, they say the people do not like works of art because they are unable to understand them, but if the work of art has the aim of infecting people with the feeling experienced by the artist, how then can we speak of incomprehension? A man of the people reads a book, looks at a painting, listens to a drama or a symphony, and feels nothing. He is told that that is because he does not know how to understand it. They promise to show a man a certain spectacle, he comes in and sees nothing. He is told that it is because his sight has not been prepared for this spectacle. But the man knows that he can see everything perfectly fine. Perfectly well. And if he does not see what they promised to show him, he merely concludes, quite correctly, that those who undertook to show him the spectacle did not fulfill their undertaking. In the same way, and quite correctly, a man of the people draws conclusions about the works of art of our society which do not call up any feelings in him. And therefore, to say that a man is not moved by art because he is still very stupid, which is both very presumptuous and very brazen, is to pervert the roles and shift the blame from the sick head to the sound. Voltaire said, tous les gens sont beaux, or le genre ennuyant. Tous les genres sont bons, or le genre ennuyeux. So all genres are good except the boring genre. So that's from his preface, the preface to his comedy L'Enfant Prodige. So he continues, with still greater right one may say about art, tous les genres sont bons, hors celui qu'on ne comprend pas, or qui ne produit pas son effet. So all genres are good except the one that is not understood or that does not make its effect. For what virtue is there in an object that does not do what it is meant to do. I'm sorry, I'm getting very tired. He continues, but the main thing is that once we allow that art can be art while being incomprehensible to certain people of sound mind, there is then no reason why some circles of perverted people should not create works that titillate their perverted feelings and are incomprehensible to anyone except themselves, and call these works art, which in fact is now being done by the so-called decadents. The course art has been taken, may be likened to placing on a circle of large diameter circles of smaller and smaller diameters, thus forming a cone, the tip of which ceases to be a circle at all. This very thing has happened with the art of our time. And so that's it for chapter 10 and the second consequence on art. Now we move to the third consequence with the 11th chapter, and we will stop with that one. The third consequence now is that art becomes a simulacra of art. And it is also related to the two preceding consequences, becoming ever poorer in content and even more incomprehensible in form. Now, it's not even art, because it lost what makes it art, and so it is no longer art, but became a simulacra of art. Or more precisely, this, shall be the fundamental characteristic of upper-class art. Art has come to be replaced by counterfeits of art. So whenever we speak of art as manifestation of beauty, we should refer to that as counterfeit art. But we need to understand why art became replaced by this counterfeit. Here again, the contrast between real art as art of the people and counterfeit art as art of the upper classes is crucial. Art of the whole people emerges only when a man of the people, having experienced a strong feeling, has need to conveying it to others. Art of the wealthy classes emerges not because of any need in the artist, but mostly because people of the upper classes demand amusements, which are very well remunerated. People of the wealthy classes demand that art convey feelings pleasing to them, and artists try to satisfy these demands. So in other words, Tolstoy insists that real art satisfies a human need, perhaps the most important one, communicating feelings. Without feelings, humans have no reason to communicate, to bond, and to form societies. At best, they communicate only in order to satisfy their personal pleasures, which goes against the very principle of uniting people. We see this with the upper classes, who call on artists not because they have feelings that they want to convey or share. They are not, after forming communion with their fellow men, but only for the artist to amuse them and please them. And of course, the artist himself, who was summoned by his upper class patrons, has no feelings of his own either. He's just a technician trying to manufacture a product to please his client and patrons. And that's precisely the point. Counterfeit art is a technical art. It's about using your skills mechanically instead of organically. You go like, this is what gives the upper classes or my circle pleasure, so this is what sells, and so I just reproduce the same formula over and over again. So this mechanical production and reproduction of art makes art lose the very thing that makes it special, its authenticity. Because let's be real here, the upper classes like to pretend that the finest things must exist in scarcity because top quality is hard to find or make, right? So that's why they always have, boners for geniuses. But because art for them is just a source of pleasure, and they have trapped themselves in an empty world where their lives, are characterized by endless boredom, their demands for pleasure never stops. And thus, their demand for art never stops either. And so art production must keep rolling endlessly. Artists must constantly produce paintings, novels, operas, dramas, songs, or whatever to keep satisfying that demand and amusing their wealthy patrons. And soon, the world has become flooded with art, with artworks that look alike. You just generated an abundance of sameness in art, and thus nothing feels authentic. No work of art is an actual authentic art, whereas works that came, from an actual artist, a man of you people, of the people, a man of the people, is always authentic, even if it is conveying a familiar feeling. Producing real art is difficult, but it doesn't mean that it can exist only in scarcity. Like we said before, a simple story told by a child can be art. So art is everywhere. It can be produced abundantly. But that's only when there is a feeling to convey. In the working classes, we have an abundance of feelings, and therefore we have an abundance of art. So art isn't difficult to produce when there is spontaneity. when people feel feelings every day and freely seek to convey them. Even if a man has no artistic skills, the simple fact that he has a feeling and express it in some way, if he infects someone with it, and that someone is an artist, that artist can put that feeling into a work of art to spread it through a wider audience. So we're not saying that the original feeling has to come from the artist either, or everyone must become an artist in order to express their feelings to others. What matters is that real art requires feelings, genuine feelings, and given that feelings cannot be replicated at will, that it must come freely from the individuals, from spontaneity, then art cannot be produced at will. So this is what makes art difficult to produce once you take out the importance of feeling and replace it with amusement. While it isn't difficult to produce an abundance of art in environments filled with diverse feelings, so in popular environments, it is difficult to do so in places that are deprived of feelings, like the upper classes. So these classes have to command the artist to provide them with art to stimulate them. And it is difficult to satisfy them because the demand for pleasure, never stops. And even the act of making art becomes tedious because it's not coming from the artist or from a genuine feeling. So given that it is coerced and forced, it cannot be art. It's just a semblance of art, as Tolstoy says. To satisfy these demands is very difficult, since the people of the wealthy classes, leading a life of idleness and luxury, demand continuous amusement from art, while it is impossible to produce art at will, even of the lowest sort. It must be born of itself in the artist. And therefore, in order to satisfy the demands of the upper classes, artists had to develop methods by which they could produce objects simulating art. So the artists, given that they are not manufacturing art, they had to come up with ways to give to their patrons and the members of their circles something else that mimics art. So how do we produce counterfeits of art? What are these methods? Well, there are 4 methods: borrowing, imitation, effectfulness, and diversion. So let's begin with the first method, borrowing. So this method consists in borrowing either whole subjects or only separate features from earlier well-known poetic works, and so reworking them that with some additions they represent something new. Such works of art evoking memories of previously experienced artistic feelings in people belonging to a certain circle produce an impression similar to that of art and pass for art among those who seek pleasure from art, if some other necessary conditions are satisfied at the same time. So you borrow subjects and objects from earlier works of art to make yours. And these subjects are usually called poetic subjects, while objects and characters are poetic objects. Example of poetic subjects depend upon the circle that you are in. In Tolstoy's case, the circle he belongs to considers all sorts of legends, sagas, and old tales as poetic subjects. And their poetic objects include maiden, warriors, shepherds, hermits, angels, devils in all forms, moonlight, thunderstorms, mountains, the sea, precipices, flowers, long hair, lions, the lamb, the dove, the nightingale. All objects used by earlier artists in their works are generally considered poetic. So he's talking about tropes, a common or a recurring theme, a plot device, a character type or figure of speech used in storytelling. But once it is overused, it becomes a cliché. It's no longer used to convey authentic and genuine feelings, but just a mechanical tool to guarantee success. Here's what your circle usually likes, so just give them that. They like sagas, so write a saga. They like mermaids, well, there's a work that they all, seem to like that has a mermaid in the plot, so put a mermaid. It's not about conveying feelings, but about, pleasing the circle. Here's a perfect example from an anecdote. Tolstoy counts that when he was in his early 30s or late 20s, he was invited by a lady, not very intelligent but highly civilized, ayant beaucoup d'acquis, meaning that she has a lot of experience, to listen to a novel that she had written but wasn't impressed as it was all made of cliché. like she just took many elements from many different earlier novels, that either the circle of people she considered authoritative and tries to impress. They found those stories beautiful, or she herself find those stories beautiful, and trying to recreate the same beauty and pleasure, she puts all those elements together to make her story. But the result is just boring and empty. Each element in the story is just used as a poetic device. It just fulfills a function, often a symbolic function only. So it serves as a function in the story, but there is no feeling there to convey. He says the action began with the heroine in a poetic forest, by the waterside in a poetic white dress with poetical loose hair, reading poetry. It was set in Russia, and suddenly from behind the bushes, the hero appeared in a hat with a feather, à la Guillaume Tell, so it was written, and with two poetic white dogs accompanying him. So Guillaume Tell is a Swiss folk hero whose legend appeared in the 15th century. He is a marksman with a crossbow who rebelled against and killed the tyrannical reeve in the Uri canton. So a guy called Albrecht Gessler, and so that encouraged the population to rebel against the tyrannical rule and found the Swiss Confederacy. He was also famous for shooting an apple off his son's head after being ordered to do so by Gessler. And a small precision now, the hat with the feather isn't a tail symbol. The hat story is that when Gessler came to power, he put a hat with feathers on a pole in the public and ordered that all the townspeople bow in front of it. And if they refuse, they'd be put to death. So Tell was the only one who refused to bow, and to bow in front of it. Well, I think he refused to bow. So the hat became associated with Tell himself, is actually a distortion of the story, but that's irrelevant. So the point is that we are anticipating a hero, the hero just from his appearance in the story. It's like the hero has no personality of his own, but is just, a collage of previous folk heroes. Like no originality because there is no feeling. Everything seemed to her all very poetic, meaning that everything is borrowed. And so this, however, wasn't as bad as what is about to follow, because had she just used symbols, she could have managed to move some of the audience members, including Tolstoy. Had she just let the images do the talking, maybe it would have been, it wouldn't have been, that bad. But she ruined it completely when she made her hero speak. And by speaking, the dialogues felt perhaps so flat that it confirmed what Tolstoy, suspected. The poetic objects and subjects were there just to embellish the emptiness of the story and lack of feeling. So the author's intention became clear that she wasn't trying to convey a feeling, but reconstruct a pleasure that she or the people she wants to impress usually experience from similar works by putting those poetic devices together. As soon as the gentleman, as he says in the hat à la Guillaume Tell, started talking with the girl in the white dress, it became obvious that the author had nothing to say, that she was moved by poetic memories of earlier works, and thought that by rummaging through these memories, she could produce an artistic impression. But this means that you take an artistic impression as pleasure. But that's not what an artistic impression is. We can, of course, trigger pleasure to others without experiencing the pleasure ourselves. That is why I say that that she either experienced that pleasure before or knew that her audience wanted that pleasure. That means that the artist who makes counterfeit doesn't have to experience or know what he wishes to trigger in his audience. Whereas with true art, an artistic impression is an infection. It works only when the author has himself experienced some feeling and conveys it in his own way, not when he conveys someone else's feeling as it was conveyed to him. Of course, earlier I said that a man can infect an artist, and that artist produces a work of art to convey the feeling he got infected with, but that doesn't mean that he conveys someone else's feelings as it was conveyed to him. Rather, when the artist conveys that feeling, it is no longer that of the other men, or at least not that of the other men's alone, but it is also the artist's. The artist doesn't just pass on a feeling in the same way as a pleasure gets passed on. The artist doesn't understand feelings in the same way as he understands pleasure, without having to experience it. He can convey a pleasure, but he cannot do that with feelings. Even if the feeling originates in someone else, if you feel it, it also becomes yours. In short, there is no such thing as faking feelings. Whenever an artist infects others with a feeling, he genuinely has that feeling. He's not telling you, look at this painting, here's how X felt, but I don't know, I don't feel that way. No, the feeling is also his. And that's why it is never mechanical or counterfeit or a borrowing. An artistic impression comes from an original work of art, not from an art that comes out of another art. The story of the lady was poetry out of poetry, and cannot infect people, and only produces the simulacrum of a work of art, and that only for people with perverted aesthetic taste. So that's the state of art in Tolstoy's time, and still in ours, with postmodern and contemporary art, you can say. In the case of the lady, who in Tolstoy's words now is very stupid and untalented, her intentions and the emptiness of her writing were obvious. No one can miss them. It's no secret that she has just borrowed, and so no one will, take her work for an actual work of art. But others, well-read and talented people with a developed artistic technique, can fool their audiences, though they are using the same method as the lady. Their borrowings from the Greek, the antique, the Christian, and the mythological world, which have multiplied so greatly and especially now continue to appear in large numbers, and the public takes for works of art in the borrowing are nicely presented by means of the technique of the art to which they belong. So an example he provides of well-read and talented people is Edmond Rostand, the 19th century and 20th century French poet and playwright, best known for his heroic comedy in verse, Cyrano de Bergerac. Tolstoy doesn't mention that play, though it was published in 1897, so the same year while his art was finished, but he mentions his 1895 play, Princesse Lointaine, so Princess Far Away. But I think that Tolstoy would have hated Cyrano and see it as 100% borrowing. He says about Princesse Lointaine that it is a typical example of artistic counterfeits, and that there is not a scintilla of art in it, but which seems to many, probably including its author, to be very poetic. And so the same holds for Cyrano. So that's for borrowing. Then we have imitation. So imitation isn't imitating other works of art, but rather imitating life to the point where you stifle your audience with the amount of details. The essence of this method consists in conveying the details that accompany what is being described or portrayed. In verbal art, this method consists in describing in minute detail the external appearance, faces, clothing, gestures, sounds, and positions of the characters with all the accidents that occur in life. Now, sure, this is precisely what the symbolists and decadents wanted to avoid. Baudelaire criticized this point precisely when he and Verlaine refused that their poetry be an exact copy of reality. But they ended up pushing borrowing to its extreme, pushing borrowing to its extreme. So just because an artist sees the limit of one of these four methods doesn't mean that he's not using any of the three others. So in imitation, for example, novels feel like they have to tell you about the voice or the tone in which a character speaks on top of her speech, or how he was doing something while doing it. So this is known as the telling versus showing technique. When you can convey a feeling by showing the action, just show the action. Plus, trying to make speeches like in real life is boring. They are poorly put together with interruptions and omissions. In the other arts, imitation is still as bad. In drama, imitation consists in presenting together with imitative speech the whole situation and all the actions of the characters as they would be in real life. In painting, this method reduces painting to photography and abolishes the difference between photography and painting. Strange as it may be, this method is also employed in music, where it tries to imitate not only with rhythm but with sounds themselves, the very sounds which in real life accompany that which it wishes to portray. So I think it's clear. The more realistic you try to be in art, the more boring and irrelevant you get. Again, the point of art is to infect others with feelings, not to imitate reality. So this one is pretty simple. So moving on to the third method, effectfulness. So this method consists in affecting external sensations, often in purely physical way, by what is called strikingness or effectfulness. So in other words, you try to stimulate physical sensations through some effects. It's the equivalent of modern day special effects, where the artist is trying so hard to force a sensation out of you by bombarding you with special effects. Like you try to overstimulate the senses of your audience. In all the arts, whether literature, painting, drama, music, you name it, these effects consist mainly in contrasts, in juxtaposing the horrible and the tender, beautiful and ugly, loud and soft, dark and light, the most ordinary and the most extraordinary. So, sure, your senses will pick up and react when in a painting you see hot and cold colors juxtaposed. But that's it. You can trigger all sorts of reactions with effects, but it doesn't mean that you conveyed any feelings. Besides the effects of contrasts, there are also effects consisting in the description or portrayal of something that has never been described or portrayed before. Like the artists, they venture into providing a detailed description of what's generally avoided or left unnoticed. Again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but this isn't the goal of art. You can describe anything that you want if that description doesn't serve the function of conveying a feeling, and bypassing that, and by assuming that there were no other more economic means to convey that feeling, then it's not art. Okay, it's not art then. But that's what many artists or works of art are about. These descriptions and portrayal of details are predominantly found in works that desperately try to arouse sexual lust, or details of suffering and death that evoke the feeling of horror. For example, in describing a murder, to give a minute description of the torn tissues, the swelling, the smell, the quantity and appearance of the blood. So again, nothing is necessarily wrong with this, and you can argue that Tolstoy is being a moralist here, and that art should shy away from taboos. But the point remains that if this is all you can provide with your art, if art that ventures into these taboos does so just for shock value, or just because it wants to trigger a physiological reaction, like horror or lust, which aren't feelings, then it's not art. So this isn't to say that you cannot use sexuality in art or horror to convey feelings. This is to say that if there are no feelings, it is useless. And so the fact that portrayal of sexuality and horror is becoming so widespread, especially among the upper classes, it is certainly not because these are great themes to convey feelings, but simply, because you can easily trigger physiological reactions with them. And let's be honest, that's all that the upper classes are after. So the same happens in the visual arts too. In painting, together with contrast of various costs, another contrast is becoming widely used, consisting in the thorough finishing of one object and the sketchy treatment of the rest. The main effects used in painting are the effects of light and the portrayal of the horrible. In the drama, the most ordinary effects, apart from contrasts, are tempests, thunderstorms, moonlight, action on the sea or near the sea, changes of costume, the bearing of the female body, madness, murders, and death in general, when the dying people convey in detail all the phases of their agony. In music, the most commonly used effects consist in following very weak unique and monotonous sounds with a crescendo and complications, culminating in the strongest and most complex sounds of the whole orchestra, or else in repeating the same sounds arpeggio in all octaves and on all instruments, or else in having a harmony, tempo, or rhythm utterly different from what would naturally flow from the course of the musical idea, but striking in their unexpectedness. So I bet that you all had images of scenes, songs, and paintings that came to your mind as I'm reading this. And I invite you to also share them in the comment if you want. You probably know many works that use these methods seen so far. And when it comes to effect, Tolstoy focused on contrast and taboos for the sake of, not for the sake of taboos, horror and sexual lust, but it's because they are just, the most common ones. But there is one more besides, which is common to all the arts. And this one is perhaps the one that Tolstoy hates the most, and it is the portrayal by one art of what is usually portrayed by another. This is when, for example, music tries to create the effect that poetry is supposed to portray, or when painting tries to portray what drama portrays. In music, Tolstoy says that some composers think that music should describe as all program music does. Program music is when you use music, not words or actions, to tell a story, to paint a specific scene or convey an idea. For example, some composers, they try to depict a battlefield or a storm through music alone. It was very popular in the 18th and 19th century classic music with Beethoven, Vivaldi, and of course Tolstoy's arch enemy. In music, Wagner and his followers, while painting, drama, and poetry, should create a mood, as is done in all decadent art. We will come back to Wagner and to the specific technique when we focus on Wagner, because he has a chapter focusing on that. So moving on to the fourth method, diversion, which is an intellectual interest added to the work of art. So this is when you add more unnecessary things to your work of art to make it feel deeper or more interesting than it actually is. Since you don't have any feelings to convey, you try to divert your audience's attention to some intellectual unnecessary stuff. Like now the audience needs to make an intellectual effort to understand and appreciate your work. It can also occur when, instead of experiencing a work of art, getting infected with a feeling, the work of art starts to look like a lecture or a documentary. We're not here to feel feelings, we are here to learn stuff. So he says, diversion may consist in an entangled plot, a method still very much in use in recent English novels and French comedies and dramas, but which is now going out of fashion and is being replaced by documentary methods. That is, by the detailed description either of some historical period or of some particular sphere of contemporary life. Thus, for instance, the diversion consists in describing Egyptian or Roman life in a novel, or the life of miners, or of salesmen in a department store. The reader becomes interested, and he makes this interest for an artistic impression. The diversion may also consist in the methods of expressing themselves. This sort of diversion is now very much in use. Poetry and prose, as well as paintings, dramas and musical pieces, are now written in such a way that they must be puzzled out like rebuses, and this process of puzzling out also affords pleasure and gives a semblance of the impression produced by art. So these are the four methods used in counterfeit art. The criteria is no longer whether it infects others with feelings genuinely felt by the artist, or whether it infects with good or bad feelings. No, now the criteria to be considered art and good art is whether art is poetical, meaning that it borrows from other works considered art, or realistic, it imitates reality, that it becomes, a copy of it, or effectual, it triggers physiological responses, or interesting, its focus moves from feeling to intellectual pleasures. And so this is how very good art is recognized now, or more precisely, these are the methods to use to make your art beautiful, meaning that your art pleases the right audience. But as Tolstoy says, not only these four methods, like neither one of them can be a standard of worth in art, but they do not even have anything in common with it. If a work of art is good because it is poetic, where poetic means borrowed, and borrowed means what suggests to an audience some vague memories of the artistic impressions that they received from earlier works of art without infecting them with a feeling that the artist himself has experienced, then it is not a work of art. It's a work, but it's not a work of art. We can't, call it art. An example is Faust by Goethe. It's very well executed, full of intelligence and very beautiful, but it expresses no feelings. Goethe, quite ironically, writing an intermediate play to warn about the dangers of endless pleasure and obsession with interminable, because Faust by Goethe is very, very long. So I said intermediate, sorry. So interminable play to warn about the dangers of endless pleasure and obsession with intellectual knowledge. He made the play not to express feelings, but to please the upper classes by putting in it all tropes he can think of and filled with diversions. So because of that, even if the play is masterfully executed, you can be sure that you will see a beautiful show, but the play is not art. It cannot produce a true artistic impression because it lacks the chief property of a work of art, wholeness, organicness, in which form and content constitute an inseparable whole expressing the feeling experienced by the artist. And in case, Goethe truly had a feeling to convey to others, in borrowing, that feeling would be a feeling that was conveyed to Goethe by an earlier work of art. And so what you should do then is tell people about that other work, or maybe translate the work if it is necessary. Why do you have to do a 2-day-long play in order to convey a feeling that another work of art already conveys? There is no way that your long-ass version has higher chances of conveying that feeling to more people than the earlier work. So if an artist is going to convey someone else's feelings, it should only be in the example of an unskillful man conveying to an artist, to someone who can make that feeling infect many people at once. And so the artist conveys that feeling if he is indeed infected by it. So it wouldn't be borrowing, since the artist isn't borrowing from a work of art in that case. But yeah, that's borrowing. The artist conveys only the feeling that he was conveyed to him by an earlier work of art, and therefore any borrowing of an entire themes or various scenes, situations, descriptions is only a reflection of art, its simulacrum, and not art itself. And therefore, to say of such a work that it is good because it is poetic, meaning that it resembles a work of art, is the same to say of a coin that it is good because it resembles a real one. So if then we say that a work of art is good because it is realistic, so we are talking about imitation, well, we have the same problem. Imitation and realism cannot be standard that are worth of art. Art is about conveying feelings, and no feelings need the amounts of detail usually found in realistic descriptions to be conveyed. And secondly, if the description is about the feeling conveyed, then infecting does not go together with a detailed description of what is conveyed. You won't infect someone with a feeling by describing the feeling. This is, again, the tension between showing and telling. Telling me how a character feels is less likely to infect me with a feeling you want to convey than showing me what the character feels. And perhaps more importantly, the process of infection gets largely disrupted by the superfluity of details. The attention of the one receiving the artistic impression is distracted by all these well-observed details, and this prevents the author's feelings, if indeed there is any, from being conveyed. So in short, bringing back the comparison with food again, imagine if I try to convince you that a dish is good for you because I gave you a detailed true description of it. A detailed, realistic description of a pizza doesn't mean that pizza is healthy and good to eat. And so the same is with art. To evaluate a work of art by the degree of its realism, by the truthfulness of the details conveyed, is as strange as to judge the nutritional qualities of food by its appearance. When we define the value of a work of art by its realism, we merely show thereby that we are talking not of a work of art, but of a counterfeit. So if then we want to evaluate good art by being effectual, so the third way, meaning by strikingness or effectfulness, here too we cannot conclude that effectual art is genuine art, just like we cannot conclude that poetic or realistic art is genuine art. And that's because, obviously, the strikingness, the effects of novelty, unexpected contrasts, horrors, do not convey any feelings, but only affect the nerves. So this is the physiological response, which doesn't imply a feeling. An artist can easily shock you, for example, through an excellent portrayal of a bloody wound. The sight of the wound will strike me, but there will be no art in it. And he continues, one drawn-out note on a powerful organ will produce a striking impression, will even call up tears, but there will be no music in it, because it conveys no feeling. And yet physiological effects of this sort are constantly mistaken for art by people of our circle, not only in music, but in poetry, painting, and the drama. So Tolstoy, in Tolstoy's time, many believe that art has become refined. But if they justify it because of the effects it provokes, it's not a good justification. If something's value is based owing to the pursuit of effects, it's probably not refined, but it has become extremely crude. So Tolstoy gives the example of the new play, Hanil. Full title is Hanil's Journey to Heaven by Hauptmann, first produced in 1895, which is showing in theaters all over Europe in Tolstoy's time. And it's about a girl, Hanil, tormented to death by her stepfather and tries to commit suicide, and the author wishes to convey to the public his compassion for her. So it's clearly a sad story, and it is good material for art. Tolstoy himself says that if Hauptmann wished to infect people with the feelings of compassion towards Hanil by means of art, he ought to have made one of his characters express this compassion in such a way as to infect everyone, or to have given a true description of the girl's sensations. Like realism is still preferable to effects in this case, apparently. But Hauptmann chose another way, more complicated for stage technicians, but easier for artists. So this again brings us back to the central issue, that producing art doesn't involve just the artists, but other people as well, the working class people. So the production of art through effect, in at least stage art, cannot give absolute authority to the artist or the playwright or the stage director. The director can think of an easy way to trigger a reaction in the audience, but to realize that reaction, it requires the coordination and labor of many people, notably technicians, like in the anecdote at the beginning of the book when Tolstoy attended a rehearsal and saw everyone, abusing everyone else. And so these extra efforts and sacrifices that the technicians had to bear could have been avoided if indeed Hauptmann wanted to convey a feeling, because that would actually be easier for everyone. But no, he wanted something else. He has the girl. The on stage, I don't know what that means. I think it's that there might be a typo, but in the Bloomsbury edition, it's he makes the girl die on the stage. So probably a typo. So he has the girl die on the stage, and furthermore, to enhance the psychological effect on the public, he puts out the lights in the theater, leaving the audience in darkness. And so the sounds of pitiful music shows the girl's drunken father pursuing her and beating her. The girl whirls, squeals, moans, falls. Angels appear and carry her away, and the audience, experiencing a certain excitement, is quite sure that this is an aesthetic feeling. But there is nothing aesthetic in this excitement, because it's not one man infecting another, but is only a mixed feeling of suffering for another and gladness for oneself, that it is not I who am suffering, like what we experience in viewing an execution or what the Romans experienced in their circuses. So no feelings are conveyed here, just the shock of witnessing something terrible happening to another person and gladness that we are not in her place. And as such, counterfeit art seems to confuse effects and aesthetic feelings, feelings we get infected with from art. So in music, this confusion or substitution of effects for aesthetic feelings is more noticeable because if there's an art that is known for its direct physiological impact on the nerves, it's music. Music affects the brain, and it is very well known. So music in particular is vulnerable to counterfeit art, and therefore here too, instead of using melody to convey the feelings experienced by the composer, the new musician accumulates and interweaves sounds, and by alternately intensifying and weakening them, produces a physiological effect on the public, which can be measured by an apparatus especially designed for that purpose. And the public mistakes this physiological effect for the effect of art. So in note 88, it's a note added by Tolstoy himself about that apparatus. He says there exists a special apparatus in which a very sensitive arrow connected with the tension of the muscle of the arm shows the physiological effect of music on nerves and muscles. But we don't care about that. So likewise, people mistake a work that is interesting for a work of art, and so this is the fourth method, the fourth diversion. The first method, diversion. So this method, as Tolstoy says, is more foreign to art than the others, and yet it is more often confused with it. And here, I think you have to thank your literature and art teachers for that confusion. You know how in high school you study some novel or drama and the teacher keeps going on and on about hidden meanings, like the author means something else than what he straight up says? This for Tolstoy isn't art. Yet this is a pretty common practice, almost ubiquitous. Everywhere, artists want their work to be interesting, thinking that this adds in its artistic value. And authors, he says, deliberate concealment of something in a novel or story which the reader must then guess. One often hears it said that a painting or music composition is interesting. But what does it mean for a work to be interesting? It can mean three things. Either it provokes unsatisfied curiosity, or as we contemplate it, it gives us information that is new to us, or else it is a work that is not entirely comprehensible, the meaning of which we figure out gradually and with effort, finding a certain pleasure in this guessing process. So, either it provokes unsatisfied curiosity, or gives us new information, or gives us pleasure in efforts to figure out the underlying concealed meaning. All features that your lit teacher probably evoked in your novel classes. But in Tolstoy's words, these are all diversions. And in none of these cases does diversion have anything to do with an artistic impression. Indeed, none of these cases have anything to do with infecting people with feeling experienced by the artist. I can make a work of art, I can make a work that is filled with unsolvable mysteries, but completely devoid of feelings. I can make it informative about all kinds of subjects, history, geography, biology, astrology, etc., without appealing to any feelings. And likewise, I can make it intelligible through intellectual efforts, but still devoid of feelings. And if there are feelings, the conveying of those feelings is the aim of art. That should be the focus, and what the audience should pay their attention to. But if you put in diversion, then the mental effort required for a spectator, listener or reader to satisfy their aroused curiosity, or to master the new information imparted by the work, or to grasp its meaning, that will absorb the reader's, spectator's, or listener's attention, thereby interfering with the infection. And therefore, what is diverting in the work not only has nothing to do with its artistic worth, but hinders rather than helps the artistic impression. So those are the four methods of counterfeit art. However, the qualities aimed at with these methods, that a work of art may be poetic, imitative, striking, or diverting, none of them can replace the chief property of art, the feeling experienced by the artist. But the upper classes have precisely done that. For them, art isn't about conveying feelings, but those four qualities. And therefore, all they have as art, what they take to be objects of art, are only resemble art and do not have as their basis the chief property of art, the feeling experienced by the artist. So it doesn't mean that you cannot include them in your work of art. But you always have to remember that they are not necessary for a work to be a work of art. And when you include them, make sure that they don't take the priority. Otherwise, you won't have art but a simulacra. And don't forget the ethical aspect of it. Don't make others have to toil to exhaustion just so that you can make your art. Now, it's true that contrary to counterfeits of art, true works of art are relatively easy to make and are more abundant. We already said that ordinary working men, as well as children, can infect others with their feelings through popular songs or stories. We've seen, the example of, the kid who tells a story about being alone with a wolf and infect others with, fear as he tells his story to even adults. And Tolstoy will later give examples of simple folk songs sang by working people, as also an example of true art better than the symphonies of Beethoven. However, in the domain of true art, there are works that are higher than others. Higher than others. And as such, as much as the kid's story is true art, it's not worth biblical stories, especially about Jesus, which Tolstoy views as the pinnacle of artistic creation. So let's call those highest works of art the true objects of art for now. So these, contrary to the abundant works, are indeed scarce, because there are many conditions necessary for a man to create a true object of art. And Tolstoy lists 3 conditions. It is necessary that the man stand on the level of the highest world outlook of his time, that he have experienced a feeling and have the wish and opportunity to transmit it, and that he has, with all that, a talent for some kind of art. So, what makes true objects of works of art scarce is that it is rare to have these 3 conditions together. It is very seldom that all these conditions necessary for the production of true art come together. I mean, the second condition is, I guess, easier to have. Everyone experiences feelings and have the wish to transmit them and the opportunity to do so, to a lesser extent. But you can say that this is rare too if here you mean new feelings that we never experienced before by anyone. That can be rare. As for condition 3, the fact that talent is needed makes it more selective, since, not everyone has the required talent to make true works of art. But the most difficult condition is the first one, to have a man stand on the level of the highest world outlook of his time. So this means someone who manages to synthesize the feelings of the people of his time, or brings in that new feelings that is going to unite all the people of his time. And these usually take on the form of, national art, the kind of art that unifies nations. But for an art that unifies the whole of humanity, that requires quite the exceptional men. But you can guess where Tolstoy is going with this. Spoiler alert, it's Jesus. He didn't just, stand on the level of the highest world outlook of his time, but of all humanity, all, past, future, and present. So indeed, the odds are always small to get the 3 conditions. But when it comes to counterfeit art, to produce, with the help of the developed methods of borrowing, imitation, effectfulness, and diversion, that simulacrum of art which is so well remunerated in our society, one need only have a talent for some kind of art, which occurs quite often. Like, sure, not everyone is born with talent or require talent, but it's not like, it's that rare. That rare, sorry. It's not like it's that rare, especially when talent can be acquired. But what is talent? According to Tolstoy, its definition depends on the art. It's the ability in verbal art to express one's thoughts and impressions with ease and to observe and remember characteristic details. In plastic art, to distinguish, remember, and convey lines, forms, and colors. In music, to distinguish intervals, to remember and convey a sequence of sounds. So these abilities can be used to either make true art or counterfeit art. But in modern societies, these talents, which are already not that common but can still be learned and mastered, are nonetheless completely wasted on simulacra of art, because that's what artists are rewarded for and encouraged to do. So he says, a man with such talent, once he has learned the techniques and methods of counterfeiting his art, if he is patient and if his aesthetic sense, which would make such works loathsome to him, has atrophied, can ceaselessly produce, to the end of his days, works which in our society are regarded as art. So society itself makes people predisposed to make like and also value counterfeit art because it perverts their taste. Instead of looking for feelings, they just look for pleasure. And like we said, you can mass produce à la chaîne products for pleasurable consumption. You can standardize what satisfies pleasure. You produce something according to some formula and that's it. You cannot do that with true art because there is no formula for feelings. So when it comes to producing counterfeits, there exist certain rules or recipes in every kind of art so that a talented man, having learned them, can produce such objects à froid, coldly, without the least feeling. And these rules and recipes exist in all forms of art. So as Tolstoy says, and we will end with this, to write poetry, a man with verbal talent To write poetry, a man with verbal talent need only accustom himself to using, in place of each single real necessary word, depending on the demands of meter and rhyme, another 10 words of approximately the same meaning, and then accustom himself to saying each sentence, which, to be clear, must have its own particular word order in every other possible verbal combination, so long as there is some semblance of meaning. And then 2, depending on words that happen to rhyme, to accustom himself to inventing simulacra of thoughts, feelings, or pictures to go with these words, and then the man can produce ceaselessly to turn out verses, short or long, religious, amatory, or civic, depending on the need. If a man talented in verbal art wishes to write stories or novels, all he need do is develop a style, that is, learn to describe everything he sees and accustom himself to remembering or noting down details. Once he has mastered that, he can ceaselessly write novels or stories depending on the demand of or his own desire, historical, naturalistic, social, erotic, psychological, or even religious, a fashion and demand for which is beginning to appear. He can take plots from his reading or from events he has experienced and copy the characters of the protagonists from his own acquaintances. And such novels and stories, if they are garnished with well-observed and recorded details, best of all erotic ones, will be regarded as works of art, though they lack even a scintilla of experienced feeling. To produce art in dramatic form, a talented man, along with everything needed for writing a novel or a story, must also learn to put it into the mouths of his characters as many apt and witty words as possible, to use theatrical effects and manage so to interweave the actions of the heroes that there is not a single long conversation on the stage, but as much bustle and movement as possible. If a writer knows how to do that, he can write dramatic works ceaselessly, one after the other, choosing his plots from criminal records or from the latest question that society is taken up with, such as hypnotism, heredity, and so on, or from the most ancient and even fantastic realms. For a man talented in painting or sculpture, it is still easier to produce objects that resemble art. All he needs is to learn to draw, paint, or sculpt, especially naked bodies. Once he has learned that, he can ceaselessly paint one painting after another or sculpt one statue after another, choosing according to his inclination mythological, religious, fantastic, or symbolic subjects, or portraying what is written about in the newspapers: a coronation, a strike, the Greco-Turkish war, the disasters of famine, or most commonly portraying all that seems beautiful, from naked women to copper basins. To produce musical art, a talented man needs still less of what constitutes the essence of art, that is, a feeling which will infect others, but on the other hand, he needs more physical gymnastic labor than for any other art, with the possible exception of dancing. To produce works of musical art, one needs first of all to learn to move one's fingers on some instrument as quickly as those who have reached the highest degree of perfection in it. Then one must learn how polyphonic music was written in the old days, that is, learn what are known as counterpoints and fugue, and then master orchestration, that is the use of instrumental effects. Once he has learned all that, the musician can then ceaselessly write one work after another, program music, operas, songs, devising sounds that more or less corresponding to the words, or else chamber music, that is taking other people's themes and reworking them by means of counterpoint and fugue within defined forms. Or most commonly, a fantastic music, taking combinations of sounds that accidentally come to hand and piling all sorts of complications and adornments on top of these accidental sounds. Thus, in all areas of art, counterfeit works are produced by a ready-made, worked-out recipe which our upper-class public takes for genuine art. And this replacement of works of art by counterfeits is the third and most important consequence of the separation of upper-class art from the art of the whole people. So that's chapter 11, sorry. That's chapter 11. So next week we're gonna start chapter 12, and we are going to continue the discussion of counterfeit art. We have just covered the characteristics in this episode of counterfeit art, and next week we are going to see the causes of counterfeit art. So that's it